Section 1. The Hidden Language of Family Guy. There is something quietly special about the way Family Guy was built from the ground up. Not just the characters, not just the humor, not just the irreverence that made it feel different from everything else airing in 1999. What makes this show genuinely fascinating, when you sit down and really study it, is the idea that the people making it were always putting things inside it that they never expected you to find. Little signals, quiet jokes, details embedded so deep in the frame that you could watch the same episode 40 times and still discover something new on the 41st viewing. That is the tradition we are going to explore tonight, in as much depth and detail as it deserves. Before we go anywhere, though, let us take a moment to appreciate the specific kind of art form that an Easter egg represents. The word itself is borrowed from the world of software development, where programmers began hiding secret features and messages inside their code during the 1970s and 1980s. The name came from the idea that discovering them felt like finding something hidden in tall grass. That same spirit migrated into video games, into films, into television. And animated television, in particular, became a breeding ground for the practice because animation gives the creators total control over every single pixel on screen. Nothing in a frame of animation is there by accident. Every color, every sign on a wall, every object sitting on a table in the background, someone made the decision to put it there. That means every one of those choices is an opportunity to say something, to reference something, to plant something that might reward a curious viewer who pauses their playback and leans in close to the screen. Family Guy, more than almost any other animated show in the history of American television, embraced this practice as a core part of its creative identity. Part of that came directly from Seth MacFarlane himself, who is famously obsessive about pop culture and about the kind of layered, reward-the-attentive viewer humor that he grew up loving. MacFarlane studied animation at the Rhode Island School of Design and worked at Hanna-Barbera before launching Family Guy, and the culture of those environments where animators were known for slipping personal jokes and tiny signatures into their work clearly left a deep impression on him. The other reason Family Guy became such fertile ground for Easter eggs is structural. The show uses cutaway gags as a fundamental building block of its comedy, and those cutaways are essentially short films inside a longer film. Each one has its own setting, its own background art, its own props. The main narrative scenes, meanwhile, are filled with domestic detail. The interior of the Griffin House, the layout of the Drunken Clam Bar, the hallways of James Woods Regional High School. All of that space needed to be filled with something, and the writing staff and the animation teams turned those filling choices into a secondary layer of storytelling that rewarded the most dedicated fans. There is also something worth understanding about the era in which Family Guy rose to its greatest prominence. The show came back from its first cancellation in 2005, right at the moment when YouTube was launching and video sharing was becoming a reality for the first time. Suddenly, fans could clip out a moment from an episode, zoom in on a background detail, slow down a sequence to catch something that flashed past in a fraction of a second, and then share what they found with thousands of other people. The Easter egg culture around Family Guy and the rise of internet fan communities grew up together, each one feeding the other. The writers knew that people would be pausing and rewinding. They wrote with that audience in mind. What you will find as we move through this tonight is that the hidden details in Family Guy fall into several different categories, and each category tells you something different about the show's creative DNA. Some Easter eggs are pure fan service references to other shows, other films, moments from pop culture history that will land like a warm hand on the shoulder for anyone who recognizes them. Some are self-referential, commentary from the writers about the show itself, sometimes celebratory, sometimes surprisingly self-critical. Some are structural recurring details that build across multiple episodes into something that starts to feel like a mythology, a hidden layer of lore running beneath the surface of the show. And some are mistakes that were never caught in time, continuity errors and animation glitches that slipped through the production pipeline and ended up in the final broadcast, creating a different kind of hidden detail, the unintentional kind that turns out to be just as interesting as the intentional one. We are going to look at all of it, every category, every season. We are going to move slowly through the history of this show and pull apart what was happening in the background, what was being hidden in the foreground, what was being telegraphed in advance, and what was being quietly commented upon in the moment. By the time we are done, you will have a completely different relationship with Family Guy, regardless of how many times you have watched it before. And with that, let us begin. Drop a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching this from and what time it is. And if you have not already, consider subscribing. Now, let us get into it. Section 2, Season 1 through 3, The Golden Age Easter Eggs. The very first episode of Family Guy aired on the 31st of January 1999. It was called Death Has a Shadow, and it followed Peter getting fired from his job at the happy-go-lucky toy factory after showing up drunk to a toy safety inspection. To make ends meet, he applies for welfare and, in typically Peter Griffin fashion, begins collecting far more in welfare checks than anyone at the government agency seems to notice. The episode is simple by the show's later standards, but it contains a small handful of details that set the template for everything to come. In that very first episode, if you look carefully at the background of certain scenes inside the Griffin home, you will notice that the family's bookshelves contain specific titles. This is a practice that continued throughout the entire run of the show. The books on shelves in the background of scenes are almost never gibberish or generic filler. They are real titles, sometimes from literature, sometimes from pop culture, sometimes jokes in their own right. In the early seasons, the selection tended to run toward things that Brian would plausibly own volumes on philosophy, politics, literature, the kind of books that a self-styled intellectual dog with martini tastes would have on his shelf. Later, as Brian's character shifted, the books on his shelves shifted with him, becoming a kind of documentary record of who the character was supposed to be at any given point in the show's history. The pilot also contains one of the first examples of a background sign being used for a hidden gag. During the welfare office scene, there are posters on the walls that, if you pause on them, contain text that is not relevant to the plot but is quietly funny on its own terms. This became one of the show's signature techniques, filling the walls of institutional spaces with bureaucratic-sounding language that either made no sense, referenced something obscure, or was a punchline in its own right. Government offices, hospital waiting rooms, school hallways, these spaces became comedy canvases that the animators treated as secondary joke delivery systems. Moving into the second episode, I Never Met the Dead Man, you get one of the earliest examples of a background character being used as a callback. Family Guy developed an enormous ensemble of peripheral quahog residents over its run, and many of them first appeared as pure background filler before being given names, personalities, and even their own storylines years later. The practice of planting a character in the background before they become important is something the show engaged in repeatedly, sometimes deliberately and sometimes accidentally, as certain background designs proved popular enough to warrant promotion to a speaking role. By the time the show hit episode 3, Chitty Chitty Death Bang, it had established several recurring visual motifs that would persist across the entire series. The Griffin kitchen, for instance, was designed with specific thought given to what would be on the refrigerator magnets, children's drawings, notes, all of which changed subtly between episodes and occasionally contained jokes or references. The refrigerator in a family home is one of those objects that accumulates the story of the people living there, and the artists who worked on the early seasons understood that and used it accordingly. There are episodes in the first 3 seasons where the drawings on the fridge, visible for only a moment in the background, comment quietly on the episode's theme in ways that you would only catch if you were specifically looking for them. Season 1 contains what many consider to be the first truly great Easter egg the show ever deployed, and it appears in the episode Love Thy Trophy. In this episode, the Griffin family gets into a dispute with their neighbors over a neighborhood trophy, and Meg ends up working at a pancake restaurant while passing off Stewie as her baby to generate sympathy tips. It is a funny episode with a lot going on, but the detail that matters most happens near the beginning, before the main plot gets moving. Stewie is sitting on the floor of the living room, playing with his building blocks the way a normal baby might. Except Stewie is not a normal baby. And if you pause on him, you can see that the blocks are arranged to spell out a specific word, redrum. For anyone who grew up on Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of Stephen King's The Shining, that word lands immediately. In The Shining, young Danny Torrance is psychically connected to the darkness haunting the Overlook Hotel, and one of the ways it manifests is through his compulsion to write the word redrum, which is, of course, murder spelled backwards on walls and mirrors throughout the hotel. The moment when his mother finally understands what the word means is one of the most chilling in that film. And here is Stewie Griffin, the murderous infant who has been plotting his mother's death since before he could walk, casually spelling it out in blocks on the living room floor while Lois chats obliviously behind him. It is a perfect reference, contextually appropriate, character consistent, hidden just enough that it rewards the viewer who catches it without alienating the viewer who does not. Season 2 built upon the Easter egg tradition with several background text jokes that have since become favorites of the fan community. The show began developing a habit of using television news broadcasts within the show as vehicles for hidden humor, with the scrolling chyron at the bottom of the news screen containing text that had nothing to do with the story being reported. Some of these chyrons referenced real events with an absurdist twist. Some were just non sequiturs. Several were self-referential comments about the show itself. All of them required either a pause or extremely fast reading to catch, and all of them rewarded the viewer who took the time. One of the most celebrated examples from the early seasons comes from the episode Model Misbehavior in Season 4, though the technique was pioneered in the earlier seasons. In that episode, when a newspaper covers the Griffin family's victory in a boat race, the main headline is about them, but if you look at the secondary headline beneath it, you find text that reads DVDs paused for headline joke millions disappointed. It is the show catching itself in the act of planting an Easter egg and making the meta-awareness of the act part of the joke. The writers knew that fans would pause their DVDs looking for hidden messages, so they put a message there specifically to acknowledge that behavior and then subvert it. That kind of layered self-awareness, the joke about the joke, is quintessential early Family Guy at its most clever. Season 2 also introduced one of the great recurring Easter egg traditions in the show's history, the use of Jesus Christ as a peripheral character. Jesus appeared in Quahog with surprising regularity across the early seasons, often doing mundane things or wandering through scenes with no explanation. The writers clearly enjoyed the absurdist potential of the Son of God existing quietly alongside the Griffin family, and they made consistent use of the character. In the Season 4 premiere, North by North, Quahog, Jesus appears driving a car, and if you look at his license plate, it reads WWID. That is a play on the phrase, "What would Jesus do?" The WWJD bracelets that were a genuine cultural phenomenon in the late 1990s and early 2000s remixed into WWID. What would I do? Which is the question that only Jesus himself could be asking. It is the kind of wordplay that works in text, that requires the viewer to pause and read a license plate, and that delivers its entire payload in 4 letters. Simple, efficient, funny. The early seasons also established the tradition of hiding real people inside the backgrounds of scenes. In an episode where Meg and Neil Goldman become junior newscasters, James Woods, who had become one of the show's running jokes through a series of appearances involving candy leading to his capture, can be spotted in the background of the news studio, dressed as Peter and being followed by a camera crew. It is a blink-and-you-miss-it cameo that works on multiple levels. First, it is just visually funny to see a recognizable face disguised as the main character in a background shot. Second, it is a callback to the James Woods running gag in a context where his appearance is entirely unexpected. Third, it suggests an entire off-screen storyline. James Woods, for reasons never explained, has disguised himself as Peter Griffin and is being filmed in the background of a TV news set that the show never addresses but leaves entirely to the viewer's imagination. The third season, which ran in 2001 before the first cancellation, represents the height of the early-era Easter egg tradition. The writers had by this point established their visual vocabulary and were operating with real confidence, hiding details that could reward repeated viewings for years. One of the most discussed examples from this period involves the recurring appearance of a character who fans eventually named Holden Caulfield, an unnamed background figure who appears in multiple episodes during the early seasons, always watching the action from the periphery with a particular expression. The character was never given an official name, but writers later confirmed that the Catcher in the Rye reference was intentional, a little literary joke embedded in the crowd scenes for anyone sharp enough to catch it. The early seasons also established the Griffin house itself as a space with hidden depth. The layout of the house is internally inconsistent in ways that were partly accidental and partly deliberate. Rooms change size, stairs lead to different places, and the exterior of the house does not always match what the interior shots suggest. Some of this is simply the continuity challenges of animated production, but some of it is intentional comedy. The house is slightly impossible, slightly dreamlike, and the artists who designed it leaned into that quality rather than fighting it. The upstairs area, where the children's bedrooms are, contains some of the richest background detail in the early seasons. Meg's room, in those first 3 seasons, was decorated with posters and memorabilia that told a consistent story about who she was, an unpopular teenage girl with specific taste in pop culture, a room that felt lived in and personal. The Luke Perry poster that hung above her bed in the early episodes became a running detail, visible in the background of multiple scenes and contributing to the sense that Meg's world was continuous and real. When that poster disappeared in a later episode, it was noticed. The absence of a recurring background detail can be as meaningful as its presence. Section 3. The biggest continuity mistakes. Seasons 1 through 7. Now we shift into different territory. Because alongside the deliberate Easter eggs and the intentional hidden details, Family Guy also accumulated a remarkable quantity of mistakes, genuine errors in continuity and canon that the writers either did not catch in time, chose to ignore, or simply did not care about. Some of these mistakes are small and visual. Some are enormous and structural. All of them are interesting because they reveal something about the creative process behind a show this large and this long-running. Let us start with the most fundamental continuity issue in the entire series, because it is the one that underpins almost every other mistake the show ever made: the ages of the children. At the beginning of the series, the Griffin children were established at specific ages. Meg was 15, Chris was 13, Stewie was 1 year old. These were not throwaway numbers, they were structural, because the ages determined what kind of storylines each character could have. A 15-year-old Meg could date, could be in high school, could have the kind of social anxieties that drove the early seasons. A 13-year-old Chris was on the cusp of high school, awkward and impressionable. A 1-year-old Stewie was the baby whose evil genius existed in ironic contrast to his developmental stage. The problem is that the show has never allowed these characters to age consistently. Across the first 7 seasons, the children aged selectively, irregularly, and often contradictorily. By series 4, Chris went to high school, which implied he had turned 14. But Meg, who should have been 2 years older and therefore approximately 16, was not confirmed to have turned 16 until seasons 4 and 5, despite having aged the same number of years. Then in season 5's Peter's Two Dads, Meg turns 17 her first on-screen birthday in 5 seasons. But Chris, who should be 2 years younger, is still referred to as 13 in the same period, despite the math requiring him to be at least 15 by then. Stewie presents the most glaring version of this problem. While Meg and Chris age slowly, inconsistently, but at least occasionally Stewie remains 1 year old for the entire run of the show. Across every birthday that Meg and Chris celebrate, through every year that passes in the world of the show, Stewie is still 1. By the time the later seasons confirm Meg's age at 18 and Chris's age at 14, the math has completely broken down. If those ages were real, Stewie would be somewhere between 3 and 5 years old. But he stays a baby, forever. The show eventually stopped even trying to reconcile this. The explanation, such as it is, belongs to the tradition of animated sitcoms operating on what is sometimes called floating time, the same logic that keeps Bart Simpson perpetually 10 years old, despite The Simpsons having been on television since 1989. Characters in animated family sitcoms exist in a kind of elastic present tense, where time passes when it is convenient for the story and stops passing when it would create complications. Family Guy pushed this principle harder than almost any other show, allowing some characters to age while keeping others permanently frozen, with no in-universe explanation offered. But the age inconsistency is just the beginning. The backstory of how Brian joined the Griffin family is one of the most egregious continuity errors the show ever produced, and it happened not between distant seasons but within a relatively compressed time frame. In Season 2's The Tan Aquatic with Steve Zissou, a flashback shows Peter meeting a stray Brian on the road and choosing to take him in. It is a simple, affecting backstory, a homeless dog being given a home by an unexpectedly kind man. But then later episodes told different versions of this story. A Season 4 flashback suggested that Brian had been with the family much longer. A Season 8 backstory presented yet another version of events with different details. By the time the show had accumulated enough seasons to layer these contradictions on top of each other, there was no single coherent account of how Brian came to live with the Griffins. The writers had told the story as many times as they needed to for individual episodes, and never reconciled the resulting inconsistencies. Brian's own age is another catastrophic continuity failure. Brian is a dog, and dogs age faster than humans. In several early episodes, the show used this fact as the basis for jokes about Brian's relative age in human years. He was referred to as being approximately 7 dog years old, which in the commonly used conversion puts him in his late 40s to early 50s in human terms. But Brian also has a biological son named Dylan, who appears in a Season 9 episode and is established as being 13 years old. A 13-year-old son is biologically impossible for a dog who is only 7 years old. The show never addressed this paradox. It simply presented it and moved on, trusting that the audience would either not notice or not care. Bonnie Swanson's pregnancy is one of the most lovingly mocked continuity errors in the show's entire history. Bonnie, the wife of Joe Swanson, was established as pregnant during the first season. She remained pregnant for approximately 4 full seasons before finally giving birth. In real time, this represented a pregnancy lasting somewhere in the vicinity of 4 years. The writers were aware of this. It became a recurring meta-joke within the show itself, with characters occasionally acknowledging that Bonnie had been pregnant for an unusual length of time. But awareness of a continuity error does not automatically fix it, and Bonnie's impossible pregnancy stands as perhaps the single most extended continuity failure in the show's history. The layout of the Griffin house deserves its own category of mistakes. Peter and Lois Griffin live in a Cape Cod-style house in Quahog, Rhode Island, and Cape Cod houses have a specific architectural characteristic. The upper floor has slanted, angled ceilings that follow the line of the roof. This was correctly depicted in some early scenes of the upstairs hallway and the parents' bedroom. But in countless other scenes set in Stewie's room, Meg's room, and Chris's room, the walls are perfectly vertical, a physical impossibility given the house's architectural style. The animators working on different episodes simply drew the rooms whichever way was most convenient for the scene, and no one enforced consistency. Peter's shirt buttons the wrong way. This one sounds minor, but it has been consistent enough across enough episodes that it qualifies as a genuine, recurring, never-corrected mistake. Men's dress shirts conventionally button with the left side over the right. The left fabric panel has the buttonholes, the right panel has the buttons. Peter's shirt is reversed, with his shirt buttoning the way a woman's blouse traditionally buttons. This error appears in the very early seasons and was simply never fixed. The show's wardrobe department, such as it is in animation, never caught it or chose not to correct it, and so Peter Griffin has been wearing his shirt incorrectly for the entire run of the series. The Drunken Clam, the bar where Peter, Joe, Cleveland, and Quagmire spend their leisure time, has undergone several significant interior layout changes across the seasons. The bar's back wall, the position of the pool table, the placement of the booths where the main characters habitually sit, all of these have shifted multiple times between episodes and sometimes between scenes within the same episode. For a location that appears in nearly every episode, this level of inconsistency is striking. It suggests that different animators were working from different reference sheets, or that no single canonical layout was ever established and enforced. One particularly well-documented animation error from the early seasons involves the color continuity in a scene where Stewie is playing with a Simon Says game while other events unfold in the background. The pattern of colored panels on the Simon Says game is visible in a close-up shot as one specific arrangement. When the camera pulls back to a wider shot, the color arrangement has changed. When it cuts back to the close-up, it has changed again. This is a mistake that almost certainly resulted from different animators working on the close-up and wide shots without properly referencing each other's work, resulting in a prop that cannot decide what color it is. The most famous visual animation error in the show, the one that appears in the IMDb Goofs section and has been cataloged by dedicated fans across multiple platforms, involves eyebrows. The characters of Family Guy have distinctive, thick eyebrows that are an important part of their expressive range. But across the show's history, eyebrows have a mysterious tendency to disappear between shots, appear on the wrong characters, or in rare cases duplicate, resulting in a character having 2 sets of eyebrows stacked on top of each other. Lois's father, Carter Pewterschmidt, is particularly prone to this in the episode Death Lives, where at least one shot gives him an extra pair of eyebrows. The eyebrow duplication error is so common in the show that fans have compiled entire lists of episodes where it occurs. During the early seasons, there was also a persistent problem with the Griffin house changing size between exterior and interior shots. The exterior of the house, as seen in the establishing shot used at the beginning of many episodes, is a compact Cape Cod with a specific footprint and roofline. But the interior of the house, particularly the living room and the kitchen, implies a significantly larger floor plan. The living room is large enough to contain a full-sized couch, a love seat, a coffee table, a television, a piano, and still have substantial open floor space. That room would not fit inside the exterior shot of the house. The show never addressed this, simply treating the interior and exterior as separate design problems that did not need to match each other. Cleveland's house is another source of persistent continuity confusion. Cleveland Brown was one of Peter's 3 primary friends for the first several seasons before departing for his own spin-off series, The Cleveland Show. During his time in Quahog, Cleveland's house was depicted in multiple ways that were not always consistent. The house's exterior changed. The interior layout shifted. When Cleveland departed and eventually returned in later seasons, neither version of his house matched particularly well with what had been shown before. The show treated his residence as a variable rather than a fixed point. There is also the matter of the giant chicken. Ernie the giant chicken is one of the show's great recurring characters, a large anthropomorphic chicken who engages Peter in elaborate, violent, over-the-top street fights at seemingly random intervals. The joke requires Peter and the chicken to be approximately matched in size and capability. But the explanation for why they fight has been told multiple times with conflicting details. In one version, the conflict started because the chicken gave Peter an expired coupon. In another telling, additional context was added. By the 3rd or 4th time the backstory was revisited, the details had drifted enough that no single definitive account existed. The origin of the Peter versus chicken rivalry is, depending on which episode you take as authoritative, slightly different each time. Section 4. Stewie's Hidden Signals and Secret Messages. Stewie Griffin is the character around whom the most interesting Easter eggs cluster, and that makes a certain kind of sense when you think about it. Stewie is, by design, a character operating on a secret level that most of the people around him cannot access. His evil plans, his sophisticated vocabulary, his weapons, all of it exists beneath the surface of what the adult world sees when they look at him. A baby playing with blocks, a toddler in a yellow shirt and a diaper, the fact that he is plotting, building, scheming, that is the hidden text that only certain observers can read. Easter eggs work the same way. They are the hidden text inside the visible surface. Stewie and Easter eggs are built from the same logic. The red rum blocks detail in Love Thy Trophy that we discussed earlier was not a one-off. The writers returned to the idea of Stewie communicating in hidden text repeatedly across the first 3 seasons. In various early episodes, Stewie's bedroom contains books and objects that, if you look at them closely, tell you something about his inner life that the dialogue does not state directly. His bookshelves in Season 1 contain, tucked among children's books, titles on military strategy, political theory, and advanced physics, the reading material of the evil genius he actually is, hidden inside the aesthetic space of a nursery. The devices and machines that Stewie builds throughout the show also function as Easter eggs in a different sense. They are references to science fiction tropes and real-world physics concepts that reward viewers with the relevant background knowledge. In early episodes, Stewie's time machine is built on principles that reference actual theoretical physics, specifically the concept of closed time-like curves, which is the technical term for a path through space-time that loops back to its own starting point. The show did not explain this. It simply designed Stewie's machine with specific details that pointed in that direction for viewers who knew enough physics to notice. One of the most detailed Stewie-related Easter eggs in the entire series appears in the Season 1 episode, Mind Over Murder. In this episode, Stewie builds a contraption that generates a time dilation field, slowing time in its vicinity. The device is depicted with specific aesthetic characteristics, particular dials, a certain kind of display screen, a housing design that are deliberate references to the time dilation equipment from classic science fiction. If you are familiar with the visual language of 1950s and 1960s science fiction film, The Machine reads as a love letter to that tradition. If you are not, it just looks like a ridiculous baby contraption. Both readings work. The Easter egg functions simultaneously as an homage and as pure comedy, depending on what the viewer brings to it. Stewie's relationship with his teddy bear, Rupert, is another source of hidden storytelling. Rupert is an ordinary stuffed bear in the eyes of the other characters. But in Stewie's reality, Rupert is a confidant, a companion, and in some episodes, something that functions almost like a conscience. The show treats the Rupert relationship as a window into Stewie's emotional interior, the part of him that, beneath the evil genius persona, is still a baby who needs comfort and connection. What makes this interesting from an Easter egg perspective is that the writers occasionally used Rupert as a hidden emotional barometer. In episodes where Stewie is in genuine distress, or where his hidden vulnerability is the thematic center of the story, Rupert is positioned differently in the frame, closer to Stewie, more visible, more central. In episodes where Stewie is in full villain mode, Rupert tends to be in the background, less prominent. This is almost certainly partly coincidence, partly the natural result of different animators making different choices. But the correlation is consistent enough to be worth noting. The episode Brian and Stewie from Season 8 is perhaps the richest single episode for Stewie-related hidden meaning. In this episode, the two characters are locked in a bank vault overnight and spend the entire 22 minutes in conversation. There are no cutaways. There is no external plot. It is just the two of them, talking honestly about their lives and their relationship. And in the course of that conversation, multiple references are made to things that were planted in earlier seasons. Stewie's gun in the safety deposit box, his emotional dependence on Brian, his darkly philosophical relationship with the concept of death. All of these things had roots in earlier episodes, and the Bank Vault episode was effectively an Easter egg decoder ring for the attentive viewer, connecting details from across the show's history into a coherent, emotional portrait of who Stewie was at that point in the series. The Bank Vault itself, as a setting, carries significant symbolic weight that feels too deliberate to be accidental. A vault is a space where things of value are locked away and protected. It is also a space where you are sealed in with whatever you have brought inside. The episode takes place in a metaphorical vault as much as a physical one. Both characters are forced to be honest about what they have been keeping locked away, and the setting externalizes that. The writers chose a bank vault when they could have chosen almost any enclosed space. The choice feels like a hidden joke about the episode's themes, the kind of detail that rewards the viewer who thinks about why specific creative decisions were made. Stewie's accent has its own hidden story. MacFarlane based Stewie's voice on Rex Harrison's performance in the musical My Fair Lady, specifically the patrician English diction that Harrison deployed as Professor Henry Higgins. This reference was never directly stated in the show, but it is one of those background details that enriches the character enormously once you know it. Stewie's voice is an imitation of a man who made his living teaching people to speak properly. There is a recursive joke buried in there, an evil baby learning to speak from a character who was himself defined by an obsession with correct speech. The reference adds a layer of meaning to every single line Stewie has ever delivered, operating as a permanent hidden context. The transition of Stewie from evil genius to emotional character over the course of seasons 4 through 7 contains its own set of hidden messages. In season 6, the two-part episode Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie is presented as a major narrative event. Stewie finally achieves his lifelong goal, kills his mother, and takes over the world. It is thrilling and darkly comic. And then the twist. It was all a simulation on Stewie's computer. None of it actually happened. This resolution has been widely discussed as a creative choice, but what is less often noted is that the simulation framing serves as a kind of farewell ceremony for a version of Stewie that the writers knew was being retired. The simulation allowed evil Stewie to complete his arc to actually do the thing he had been trying to do for 6 seasons within a frame that kept the show's universe intact. It was a goodbye dressed as a plot device, a hidden message about a character transition that the writers were not ready to announce directly. After those episodes, Stewie's evil plots became increasingly rare. The weapons and machines showed up occasionally but were no longer central to his character. What replaced them were stories about his friendships, his insecurities, and his identity. The things that had been hidden inside Stewie, the emotional vulnerability beneath the villainy, became the surface, and the villainy became the memory. The Easter egg tradition around Stewie shifted accordingly, from references hidden in his evil devices and schemes to references hidden in his emotional moments and his relationships. There is one Stewie detail that spans the entire series and functions as perhaps the longest-running hidden joke in the show's history. From the very first episode, it was ambiguous whether most of the adult characters could actually hear Stewie speaking. The joke was partly that adults could not understand him, that his sophisticated dialogue registered as baby babble to Lois and Peter and everyone else. But the show was never entirely consistent about this. Some scenes clearly showed adults reacting to specific things, Stewie said. Other scenes just as clearly showed them ignoring him entirely. The inconsistency was never resolved because it served different comic purposes at different moments. The ambiguity itself became the Easter egg, a question planted in Season 1 that was never definitively answered in any season that followed. The Season 8 episode, Road to the Multiverse, contains a Stewie Easter egg that has been spotted by fans who know their science fiction. When Stewie produces his multiverse remote control, the device that allows him and Brian to jump between parallel universes, careful viewers will notice that the device is, in fact, a toy tricorder from Star Trek, The Next Generation, being held upside down. Specifically in the sequence in the reverse universe, the prop's origins are most visible. It is the kind of in-joke that requires the viewer to both recognize a piece of Star Trek memorabilia and notice that it has been repurposed as the show's central sci-fi MacGuffin. The Star Trek reference is entirely in keeping with the science fiction tradition that Stewie's character draws from, and using it as a multiverse travel device is precisely the kind of quietly clever detail that the early seasons built their reputation on. Section 5. Brian's Easter eggs and the writer's alter ego. Brian Griffin is a dog who reads Proust, drinks scotch, and writes fiction that never quite achieves the greatness he believes it deserves. He is also, as many fans and critics have noted over the years, the character in Family Guy who most directly represents the writing staff, specifically Seth MacFarlane himself. Understanding Brian as an autobiographical figure, even a partly satirical one, unlocks a whole secondary layer of meaning in the details that surround him, because many of the Easter eggs hidden in Brian's world are actually quiet confessions and jokes about the people who created him. Consider the running joke about Brian's novel. Throughout multiple seasons, Brian describes himself as a novelist working on a manuscript that he has been developing for years. The novel's existence is a recurring character detail. It establishes Brian as someone who sees himself as a serious artist, a literary figure, a writer of substance. And yet the novel never gets finished. In the episodes where Brian's writing is directly addressed, the novel is almost always presented as an excuse, a psychological shield, something Brian uses to maintain an identity he has not actually earned. He is a writer who does not write, an intellectual who borrowed his sophistication from books rather than from original thought. This is a joke about the anxiety of the creative person, specifically the anxiety of someone who works in an industrial creative environment like a television writer's room, where everything is collaborative and commercial, and the dream of producing a singular artistic statement keeps retreating to tomorrow. The writing staff of Family Guy, many of whom held or aspired to literary ambitions, were writing this joke about themselves. Brian's failed novel is an Easter egg for anyone who has ever known a creative person who talked more about their project than they actually worked on it, and for anyone who was that person. In the Season 3 episode Brian Does Hollywood, Brian travels to Los Angeles to pursue his dream of becoming a screenwriter. He does not find success as a screenwriter. He finds success as a director of adult films. The episode is a comedy, but it contains a hidden observation about Hollywood that is fairly sharp. The idea that the town has a seemingly infinite appetite for certain kinds of content and a much more limited appetite for serious artistic work, and that talented people often find themselves succeeding in unexpected directions. The Adult Film Awards sequence in this episode contains the hidden detail mentioned in the research material John Williams, the composer of the most beloved film scores in Hollywood history, is listed as a nominee for Best Original Score in an Adult Film. Williams has scored Star Wars, Jaws, E.T., Schindler's List, and Jurassic Park. The notion of him scoring a pornographic film is simultaneously absurd and, if you think about it for a moment, makes a particular kind of satirical sense about the intersection of commerce and art in Hollywood. Brian's bookshelf, across the early seasons, contained specific titles that told you exactly who he was supposed to be. Chekhov, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, the kind of canonical American and European literature that a certain kind of intellectual dog would feel obligated to own. But attentive viewers noticed that as the seasons progressed and Brian's character shifted toward pretension and self-deception, the titles on his shelf began to change in subtle ways. The canonical works were still there, but they were joined by self-help books, business bestsellers, the kind of reading material that Brian of Season 1 would have mocked. The bookshelf was quietly telling the same story as the character arc. In Season 9's Brian Writes a Bestseller, the book Brian produces when encouraged by Stewie is a self-help title called Wish It, Want It, Do It. The title is a joke on the genre of inspirational nonfiction that became enormously popular in the early 2000s. Books about manifestation and positive thinking that made vast fortunes for their authors while often making promises their content could not quite keep. Brian produces something exactly like those books, and it becomes a massive commercial success, which allows the episode to make a specific point. That commercial success and artistic merit are not the same thing, that the book-buying public has a sometimes baffling taste for a certain kind of optimistic, breezy content that serious writers tend to look down on. The fact that Brian, the self-styled literary intellectual, achieves mainstream success with exactly the kind of book he would have despised in Season 1 is the Easter egg. The hidden joke is about the compromises that define a creative career. One of the most subtle Brian-related Easter eggs in the entire series is the recurring detail of Brian's martini glass. In the early seasons, Brian's drink of choice was established as a dry martini, a sophisticated, classic cocktail that matched his voice of reason persona. The martini is a grown-up drink with a specific cultural identity, and Brian's relationship with it was one of the early touches that made him feel like a real, consistent character. But across the seasons, careful viewers have noted that Brian's drinking habits shifted. The martini appeared less frequently. He was shown drinking wine, drinking beer at the Drunken Clam with Peter, drinking various other things. The martini did not disappear, but it became less exclusively his signature. This drift in Brian's drinking detail tracks alongside the broader drift in his character, the voice of reason becoming less consistently reasonable, the sophisticated intellectual becoming less consistently sophisticated. The episode Jerome is the New Black in Season 8 contains the famous Quagmire speech, where Glenn Quagmire, the show's most comically inappropriate neighbor, delivers a systematic and entirely accurate critique of Brian's character. Quagmire calls out Brian's phoniness, his failed writing career, his pretentiousness, his hypocrisy. The speech is remarkable not just for its content but for its delivery. Quagmire, a character who exists primarily as an exaggeration of a particular kind of masculine bad behavior, is made the instrument of truth-telling about another character's failures. The writers use the show's most disreputable figure to say the truest things about the show's ostensibly most enlightened figure. That inversion is itself a hidden Easter egg about the show's moral architecture. The idea that in a world as morally confused as Family Guy's, truth-telling often comes from unexpected sources. The Quagmire speech also contains a specific detail that rewards viewers who have been paying attention across multiple seasons. Quagmire accuses Brian of abandoning his son, a reference to Dylan, who appeared in a handful of episodes as Brian's biological child before disappearing from the show with no explanation. Quagmire, knowing about Dylan and specifically citing his abandonment as evidence of Brian's bad character, required the viewer to remember an earlier episode, to have maintained continuity across a significant gap in the show's timeline. It was a callback Easter egg, a hidden connection between distant moments in the series that rewarded long-term viewers while flying entirely over the heads of casual ones. Section 6. The Death and Rebirth of Brian. Hidden clues nobody noticed. In November 2013, Season 12's 6th episode, Life of Brian, aired on Fox and the internet promptly caught fire. Brian Griffin, the talking dog, the martini drinker, the failed novelist, one of the show's 4 main voice actors, performed by Seth MacFarlane himself, was struck by a car in front of the Griffin house and died. He died in the veterinarian's office surrounded by the family, with his last words expressing his love for them. It was sudden, emotionally effective, and genuinely shocking in a way that Family Guy had not managed to be for years. The reaction was massive. The story trended on social media for days. Petitions circulated demanding Brian's return. Media outlets ran pieces on the death of a cartoon dog with the same earnestness that might accompany a real cultural loss. And then, just 2 episodes later, in the Christmas episode, Christmas Guy, Stewie was able to travel back in time using a time machine acquired from his own past self and save Brian's life. Brian came back, everything returned to normal, and a significant portion of the fandom felt that the whole thing had been a rating stunt, an emotional manipulation that was undone almost immediately. Whether or not the creative team intended it as a stunt, what is genuinely interesting from an Easter egg perspective is the set of hidden details that preceded Brian's death and that look, in retrospect, like foreshadowing, though it is impossible to know from the outside how much of this was deliberate and how much was coincidence given shape by hindsight. The most discussed piece of potential foreshadowing is structural, and it involves the time machine. In the same episode where Brian dies, Stewie destroys his time machine at a junkyard because he is tired of the dangerous situations their time-traveling adventures keep creating. He crushes the machine. He confirms it is gone. This happens in the same episode and immediately before Brian's death. The time machine's destruction removes the one obvious narrative mechanism that could be used to save Brian, which means that for the first time in the show's history, Brian's death carries consequences that cannot immediately be undone by the existing tools of the show's universe. The writers took away the safety net and then had something fatal happen. Whether this was deliberate narrative engineering or coincidental framing is genuinely unclear. But the symmetry is striking. The episode announces that the time machine is gone, then a car comes around a corner and Brian is gone too. The two events are connected by the logic of consequence. If the time machine existed, Stewie would immediately use it. Its absence is what makes Brian's death feel permanent. And its absence is established within the same episode, as if someone in the writing room understood that the machine's destruction was the setup and Brian's death was the payoff. What is also interesting is a detail noted by fans who went back and cataloged earlier episodes after Brian's death. In Road to the Multiverse from Season 8, the human version of Brian in the inverted universe, the universe where humans are pets and dogs are the dominant species, is also killed by being struck by a car. The exact same cause of death. The show had established in an earlier season that one version of Brian dies when hit by a vehicle and then deployed that same end for the main Brian. Whether this constitutes foreshadowing or simply represents a writing team that had Brian's mortality on the brain is an open question, but it is the kind of detail that fans who caught it felt deserved recognition. The introduction of Vinny, the Italian-accented dog who replaced Brian in the episodes following his death, contained its own set of hidden details. Vinny was voiced by Tony Sirico, best known as Paulie Walnuts from The Sopranos, a casting choice that brought a specific cultural weight to the character. The show had always used voice casting as a form of hidden reference, and giving the replacement dog the voice of one of the most beloved figures from prestige cable drama was a choice that worked on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, it was a funny incongruity, a mob enforcer's voice coming out of a domestic pet. Beneath the surface, it was the show acknowledging, in a coded way, that it was doing something a little bit transgressive by replacing an original character with a newcomer and choosing to cast that newcomer with a voice that carried its own considerable authority. Vinny also made a subtle meta-joke through one of his running gags, which involved him calling his mother on the phone to update her on his experiences living with the Griffin family. These calls were brief, warm, and quietly affectionate. They established Vinny as a character with a family he cared about, a history outside the Griffin household, a life that predated his arrival in the show. This is the opposite of how the show usually treated new characters, who typically arrived without backstory and were deployed for the immediate comedic purpose. Vinny was given depth right away, and that depth was the hidden message the show was making Vinny genuinely compelling in the brief time it had him, which made his eventual departure and Brian's return bittersweet in a way the writers probably did not fully intend. When Stewie ultimately saves Brian in Christmas Guy, the mechanism is a chance encounter with his own past self. A version of Stewie from the Christmas episode travels forward from an earlier point in time And the present-day Stewie is able to steal a time device from him, a device that has not yet been destroyed because it belongs to a version of Stewie from before the junkyard visit. This is, as time travel logic goes, relatively internally consistent. The show did not create a paradox. It created a window of opportunity that existed precisely because of the specific sequence of events in life of Brian, and it used that window with a degree of craft that fans who were still processing their anger about the death did not always give it credit for. The episode note that Brian was killed in the same way his Road to the Multiverse counterpart was killed is documented in the official Family Guy wiki, which treats it as a genuine callback. Whether the writers intended the earlier death as an actual foreshadowing of the main timeline's Brian, or whether they simply defaulted to the same cause of death when writing both scenes without tracking the connection, the result is the same from a viewer's perspective, a hidden thread connecting two seasons and adding retrospective weight to both events. Section 7. Production errors and animation mistakes that slipped through. Animation production is a collaborative, distributed process involving hundreds of people across multiple locations, often in different countries. A single episode of Family Guy passes through writers who draft the script, producers who approve it, storyboard artists who plan the shots, voice actors who record the dialogue, animators who draw and move the characters, background artists who paint the environments, compositors who put it all together, and editors who assemble the final cut. At every single one of those stages, there are opportunities for small errors to be introduced, and at every single one of those stages, there are opportunities for those errors to go unnoticed and make it into the final product. Family Guy has produced more episodes than almost any other animated comedy in American television history. As of the mid-2020s, the show had crossed 250 episodes. Each one of those episodes was made under the kind of tight deadline pressure that characterizes commercial television production. The result is a catalog of animation errors that, taken together, constitute their own kind of hidden history of the show, an accidental archive of where the production process broke down. The eyebrow duplication error we discussed in the continuity section deserves further examination here, because it is the most consistently occurring animation mistake in the show's entire history. The eyebrows of Family Guy characters are drawn as separate elements from the rest of the face, overlaid on top of the base facial artwork. This separation of elements is standard animation practice and makes it easier to animate expressions. You can move the eyebrows independently of the rest of the features. But when files are combined or when animators working on different scenes fail to sync their assets properly, the eyebrow layer can appear twice, giving characters an extra set of brows floating above the first set. This has happened to nearly every character in the show at some point. Regular viewers have learned to spot it. In some cases, particularly attentive fans have noted that the eyebrow duplication tends to occur more frequently in later seasons when production was happening faster and under tighter schedules. The disappearing objects problem is a category of error that appears across virtually every season. This is the specific mistake where an object that is clearly visible in one shot simply is not there in the next shot, despite no narrative reason for it to have moved or been removed. The research on this reveals some striking examples. In one early episode, glass shards that result from Quagmire jumping through a window are clearly visible on the ground in the first shot. In the immediately following shot, the glass is gone. No one cleaned it up. It just stopped existing between cuts. In another episode, a candle holder that is prominently visible in a dining room scene disappears entirely between shots. In a third, mashed potatoes on a plate transform into peas between one angle and the next, while a second glass also materializes from nowhere. These errors are the result of a specific challenge in animation production. When a scene requires multiple camera angles, different animators working on those angles sometimes draw the background objects in slightly different configurations, or forget objects that were in the other shots entirely. In live action, a continuity supervisor watches over the set to prevent exactly this kind of error. In animation, the equivalent supervision happens in post-production when an editor reviews the assembled scene. But when schedules are tight and episode counts are high, some of these errors are simply noticed too late or not at all, and they end up in the broadcast. The room layout mistake in the university episode where a hallway has room 105 on one side when the characters enter, and on the opposite side when they walk further down, is a more fundamental kind of error than the disappearing objects. This is not a small detail that was missed in the background. This is a major set element that physically changed position between shots. The animators drawing the corridor scene failed to establish or agree on which side of the hallway the room was on, and both versions made it into the final cut. The result is a hallway that defies Euclidean geometry, with a door that the characters somehow pass without it having moved. The exterior to interior size mismatch of the Griffin house, discussed earlier as a continuity issue, is also an animation production problem in the sense that it reflects a failure to establish and enforce a consistent standard. Early in the show's production, reference sheets would have been created showing the house's layout, but reference sheets for different areas of the house were almost certainly created by different people, and the priority was making each individual space look good for the scenes that happened inside it, rather than ensuring that all the spaces added up to a coherent architecture. When you animate a kitchen, you are not simultaneously animating the exterior of the house. The two come together only in the mind of someone who is specifically tracking consistency across both, and in a high-volume production, that tracking often falls through the cracks. In the Season 2 episode E Peterbus Unum, there is a background character whose wrist visibly clips through his sleeve, a digital animation artifact, where one element of the character model intersects with another in a way that would be physically impossible. This type of error became more common as the show transitioned from traditional animation techniques toward digital production. In the early seasons, all the characters were drawn on paper or digitized from paper originals, which meant that the physical constraints of actual paper drawing prevented certain kinds of visual impossibilities. As digital animation became the standard, the tools allowed for a greater variety of errors because the software could generate positions that traditional drawing would have prevented. One of the most striking categories of production error in Family Guy involves lighting and time-of-day continuity. In the Season 2 episode, Forefather, a scene that begins at night transitions to day between shots without any narrative time jump having occurred. Characters who are clearly operating in darkness in one shot are suddenly lit by daylight in the next, then back in darkness the shot after. This kind of error results from animators working on different parts of a sequence without consistently establishing the time of day, or from post-production color grading choices that were applied inconsistently across shots. The Peter and Lois positioning error in Meg's room, where they are standing in the middle of the room on a rug in one shot and then suddenly standing next to the window on the opposite side of the room in the next, represents a category of error where character blocking was not tracked across the cuts. In live action, blocking the physical positions and movements of actors within a scene is carefully planned and maintained by both the director and the script supervisor. In animation, blocking is determined by the storyboard, but if different animators work on different shots from the same storyboard without careful coordination, characters can teleport between positions in the time it takes to cut from one angle to another. The Lois car error, where Lois and Meg are shown taking the red car for a spa vacation only for Peter to be seen driving that same car multiple times while they are supposedly away, is a particularly clear example of the show's script tracking failures. This is not an animation error per se, it is a writing or editing error. Either the scripts for the episode's subplots were not cross-referenced carefully enough to catch the contradiction, or the error was noticed but deemed minor enough to leave rather than fix. Given the volume of content the writing staff was producing, the latter explanation is entirely plausible. What all of these errors share, across their different categories and causes, is that they are visible evidence of the industrial conditions under which Family Guy was produced. The show at its peak was generating 22 episodes per season, each episode requiring hundreds of individual decisions about color, shape, position, lighting, timing, dialogue, and dozens of other variables. At that volume, with that many moving parts and that many individual contributors, some errors are not just possible, they are inevitable. The question is not whether mistakes will be made, but how many will be caught before broadcast. Family Guy's track record suggests that the answer, across 24-plus seasons, is quite a lot, but not all of them. Section 8. The deepest cut references. Pop culture Easter eggs. Family Guy built its reputation, in part, on the density and specificity of its pop culture references. The show was not content to reference popular things. It wanted to reference specific things within those popular things, the detail inside the detail, the moment inside the movie, the line inside the song. This is the approach that produced some of the most celebrated Easter eggs in the show's history, and it is also what drew the show's loudest critics, who argued that pure reference making is not the same as actual comedy writing. The debate about reference-based humor is genuine and worth taking seriously. But what is not debatable is that when Family Guy's deep-cut references worked, when they targeted something specific enough that recognizing it felt like a genuine discovery, they worked exceptionally well. The best ones function as private conversations between the show and its most attentive viewers, moments that fly entirely past casual viewers while landing with particular force for the people who get them. The Star Wars connection is the deepest and most extensively documented vein of pop culture Easter eggs in the show's history. MacFarlane is a well-known Star Wars obsessive, and the show's 3 Star Wars parody episodes, Blue Harvest, Something, 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 Dark Side, and It's a Trap, are packed with references that operate at multiple levels of depth. The title, Blue Harvest, itself is the first Easter egg, and it is one that most casual viewers missed entirely. Blue Harvest was not a made-up name for the episode. It was the actual code name used by George Lucas's production company when filming Return of the Jedi in 1982. The code name was created because the production was so large and so visible that keeping it secret required disguising what was actually being filmed. Cast and crew working on the production wore gear branded with the Blue Harvest name, and local media in the areas where location filming occurred thought they were working on a horror film called Blue Harvest. The ruse eventually fell apart. The actual title was revealed at San Diego Comic-Con in 1981, but the fake name became a piece of Star Wars lore. The kind of insider detail that fans of the films carry without most people ever knowing it. Using it as the episode title was MacFarlane saying, quietly, that this parody was made by someone who knew the subject material all the way down to the production footnotes. Inside Blue Harvest, the detail that has been most discussed is Roger from American Dad and Bender from Futurama, both appearing in the Mos Eisley Cantina scene. This is a crossover Easter egg of the most generous kind, 2 beloved animated characters from entirely different universes getting a brief moment in the Family Guy universe, hidden in the background of a crowd scene where casual viewers would likely not notice them. Roger and Bender in the cantina is a gift for the kind of viewer who watches animated television broadly enough to recognize faces from multiple shows, and who will experience a particular delight at finding them sharing a screen. It is also a formal joke about the cantina scene itself, which, in the original film, is famous precisely for its density of alien creatures, and the implication that an entire galaxy's worth of exotic beings has converged on this one watering hole. Of course, other animated characters would be there. It is that kind of bar. The second Star Wars parody, Something, 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 Dark Side, takes its title from the meme that grew out of Star Wars fan culture. The idea that Darth Vader's final sentence before offering to rule the galaxy with Luke as his son trails off into an improvised version of the actual quote. The title is the show name-dropping a piece of internet culture that itself originated from the films, layering the reference too deep. The episode also contains a Rush Limbaugh radio show playing in the speeder that Chris is driving, where Limbaugh's on-air commentary expresses frustration with Lando Calrissian's appointment as head of Bespin, and then dismisses concerns about Hoth melting as a commentary on global warming. This is a double Easter egg, a reference to a politically pointed real-world figure layered over the Star Wars setting, making a satirical point about the intersection of racial politics and environmental denial while being set in a galaxy far, far away. The third parody, It's a Trap. The title itself being a reference to Admiral Akbar's famous line from Return of the Jedi, contains the most self-aware Easter egg in the entire trilogy. Near the episode's end, Emperor Palpatine, voiced using Carter Pewterschmidt's voice, tries to antagonize Chris as Luke by insulting Seth Green, who voices Chris and is also the co-creator and star of Robot Chicken, which had produced its own popular Star Wars parody special before Family Guy entered the field. The Emperor says that Seth Green has never made anything popular and refers to that god-awful puppet show. This is the show eating its own tail, a Family Guy character insulting the creator of Robot Chicken. While that character is voiced by the creator of Robot Chicken, during a Star Wars parody that exists in conversation with Robot Chicken's own Star Wars parody, in an episode whose title is a reference to a line spoken by a character in the original film. Every layer of that joke is a different Easter egg, each one visible only if you know the relevant context. Outside the Star Wars universe, Family Guy deployed its most effective deep-cut references in two primary ways: through the background audio of scenes and through what you might call structural homages, episodes or scenes designed to mirror specific scenes or moments from other works, closely enough that viewers who knew the source material would recognize the shape of what they were watching. The Wilhelm scream is a frequently cited audio Easter egg. For those unfamiliar with it, the Wilhelm scream is a specific recorded scream that has been used in Hollywood films and television since the 1950s, originally recorded for a 1951 Western and then borrowed, reused, and eventually turned into a deliberate in-joke by sound editors who recognized it from earlier productions. It appears in the original Star Wars trilogy, in Indiana Jones, in hundreds of other films and television shows. It became famous when editors began incorporating it as a knowing wink to film-literate audiences. Family Guy used it several times across its run, each time hiding it in a scene of physical comedy where a character falls, gets hit, or otherwise experiences sudden impact. You have to be listening for it to catch it. When you do catch it, it lands as a quiet recognition, a signal from the show that it is aware of film history and is making a joke about that awareness simultaneously. The All in the Family reference during Season 6 is another example of a structural homage that functions as a hidden Easter egg. All in the Family was the groundbreaking 1970s Norman Lear sitcom that dealt directly with racism, sexism, and generational conflict in ways that American television had never attempted before. When Family Guy paid homage to it, the show reproduced specific visual and structural elements of the original so closely that viewers who knew All in the Family would recognize them immediately, while viewers who had never seen that show would simply see an unusual stylistic choice. The Easter egg exists only in the gap between those two audiences in the experience of the viewer who knows both texts and can appreciate the translation from one to the other. The Silence of the Lambs reference in the scene where Meg humiliates Chris by showing a video of him doing Buffalo Bill's Goodbye Horses dance contains a second Easter egg that operates at the level of production history, rather than narrative content. Seth Green, who voices Chris, got the role partly because, when he auditioned, a friend dared him to do his best Buffalo Bill impression for the audition rather than a conventional character voice. He did the impression. He got the role. So, the scene where Chris is humiliated via a Buffalo Bill parody is simultaneously a reference to The Silence of the Lambs and a hidden reference to the story of how the character of Chris came to exist, a piece of production lore made visible on screen. The Catcher in the Rye referenced the unnamed background character that fans and writers have called Holden Caulfield, who appears in multiple early episodes watching the action with a specific expression, periodically calling Peter a big fat phony, works as an Easter egg for viewers who have read the novel, because J.D. Salinger's Holden Caulfield is defined by his compulsive identification and condemnation of phonies. Having a figure defined by that novel's central obsession wander through the background of Peter Griffin's adventures, repeatedly accusing Peter of the thing that Holden hates most, is a joke that operates entirely in literary space. It requires no animation technique, no visual pause, no slow-motion playback. It requires only that you have read a book and that you are paying attention to a background character. Section 9. Character inconsistencies and the biggest canon mistakes. Beyond the age contradictions and the structural continuity failures discussed earlier, Family Guy has produced a specific category of error that deserves its own section, the character inconsistency. These are moments where a character is shown doing, saying, knowing, or feeling something that directly contradicts what we have been told about them in earlier episodes, not because the character has grown or changed, but because the writers forgot or chose not to track what had been established before. Peter Griffin's backstory is a maze of contradictions. The show has offered multiple different accounts of his childhood, his family history, his education, and even his nationality. In the early seasons, Peter was established as being of Irish and Italian descent, a working-class Catholic who grew up in a specific Rhode Island neighborhood with specific childhood experiences. But as the show accumulated seasons and the backstory expanded through cutaway flashbacks, contradictory childhood memories multiplied. Peter was shown having experiences in his past that could not all be true simultaneously. He attended schools that were incompatible with each other. He had parents who were referenced differently across episodes. The biggest canon mistake about Peter's origin involves his father. In several early seasons, Peter's father is established as Francis Griffin, a devout Catholic who is played for laughs as a rigidly religious, humor-free man who disapproves of Peter's wife and lifestyle. Francis Griffin appears in multiple episodes across multiple seasons with consistent characterization. And then, in a later episode, it is revealed that Peter's biological father is actually a man named Mickey McFinnigan, an Irish drunk from Quahog who had an affair with Peter's mother. This revelation is treated as a significant plot point in the episode it occurs in, but it creates an enormous retroactive problem. Either Francis Griffin is not Peter's father, which contradicts years of established characterization, or the show has simply introduced a new story without fully reconciling it with what came before. The Peter and Lois relationship history has been told in multiple incompatible ways. The circumstances under which they met, the nature of their early courtship, and the timeline of their marriage have all been addressed in flashback episodes that do not fully agree with each other. In some tellings, Peter and Lois met at a specific event, and the romance progressed in a specific sequence. In other flashbacks, the details are different. The broad strokes: they met, they fell in love, they married despite some family opposition, remain consistent. But the specific moments that would make those broad strokes feel real have never cohered into a single authoritative account. Cleveland Brown's characterization underwent a particular kind of transformation that deserves examination here. Cleveland was one of Peter's 3 closest friends for the first several seasons, characterized as slow-speaking, gentle, and endlessly patient with the more extreme behavior of his companions. His defining characteristic was a kind of tranquil, unflappable good nature, the one member of the group who almost never got angry. The gag was that Cleveland would always be calm, even when circumstances demanded reaction. When the Cleveland show was spun off in 2009, Cleveland moved away with his new wife and children. When he returned to Family Guy in later seasons, his characterization had shifted noticeably. The patient, tranquil Cleveland of the original run was not quite the Cleveland who came back. Some of this can be attributed to natural character development. A man who has been through a divorce and a remarriage and a relocation is probably a different person than he was before all of that. But some of it was simply inconsistency, the show not tracking who Cleveland had been with the same care it applied to the other characters. Joe Swanson's evolution represents one of the show's most clearly traceable character inconsistencies. Joe was introduced in the first season as the archetypal, competent, capable man, a police officer, and a wheelchair user who was defined by his toughness, his capability, and the respect he commanded from everyone around him. Peter was genuinely jealous of Joe's popularity and capability when they first met. Joe was the guy everyone admired. That was the character. But across seasons, Joe's characterization flattened. He became less capable, more of a figure of sympathy and occasional mockery. The disability that had originally been a detail within a larger portrait of competence became increasingly central to how other characters related to him. His marriage deteriorated. His self-esteem declined. The Joe of Season 8 or 9 was a genuinely different person from the Joe of Season 1, and not in a way that felt like growth, more like drift. The most egregious single-character inconsistency in the show's history is probably the various accounts of how and when Lois became a pilot. In one episode, it is established as something she has always known how to do. She grew up in a wealthy family with access to that kind of training and experience. In another episode, she learns to fly within the episode's time frame as a new skill. In a third, her relationship with flight is presented differently still. The writers treated Lois's pilot abilities as a modular plot device available when the story needed it, not mentioned when it did, not without ever establishing a definitive account of when or how she acquired that skill. Adam West, the mayor of Quahog, voiced by the late real-life Adam West, presents a specific kind of inconsistency. The character is deliberately unhinged, a joke about the nature of small-town political power that also functions as a tribute to and gentle parody of the real Adam West's legacy as the original Batman. Mayor West is characterized by a specific kind of logical non sequitur. He follows his own reasoning to conclusions that make no sense to anyone else but are perfectly consistent within his own framework. This characterization was deployed reliably across many seasons, but the specific content of Mayor West's obsessions and delusions shifted substantially across the show's run, sometimes feeling like a different kind of madness than the one originally established. The character survived his obsessions where other characters did not, because the writers understood that the Mayor West gag had a nearly infinite reservoir of content. The Brian and Lois romantic tension is another area of significant inconsistency. In the very early seasons, Brian's feelings for Lois were treated as a real, poignant character detail, a genuine, unrequited love that Brian mostly kept to himself. The tension was handled with a degree of sensitivity that made both characters more interesting. But in later seasons, this thread became sporadic, inconsistently applied, and occasionally deployed simply as a device for a specific plot rather than as something rooted in who Brian was. Episodes sometimes acted as if the Lois feelings did not exist. Episodes in other seasons brought them back without acknowledging the gap. The romantic tension was a detail that existed when the story needed it and stopped existing when it did not, which is a reliable way to make character details feel disposable. Section 10, Seasons 8 through 15. The Easter egg golden era nobody talks about. There is a tendency, when discussing Family Guy's later seasons, to focus almost exclusively on what went wrong. The character decline, the cutaway overuse, the cruelty towards certain characters. All of those things are real and worth discussing, but they exist alongside a continuation and, in some ways, a deepening of the show's Easter egg tradition, because the writers who were putting the show together in seasons 8 through 15, whatever their other tendencies, were still putting things in the background that rewarded careful attention. The Brian and Stewie episode from season 8, already discussed in detail in the Stewie section, deserves additional consideration here because it functions as an Easter egg in a structural sense. The episode is built around the absence of the show's usual comedy architecture. No cutaways, no external plot, no third-party characters, just two characters in a room. For a viewer familiar with how Family Guy normally works, this stripped-down structure is itself a hidden message. We are doing something different here. Something that requires you to pay a different kind of attention than you normally pay to this show. The episode's unusual format is the first Easter egg, the one that alerts you that the content will be unusual too. Back to the Pilot from Season 10 is another episode that functions as a sustained Easter egg about the show's own history. In it, Brian and Stewie use the time machine to travel back to the first episode of Family Guy, allowing the characters to interact with their earliest versions. The episode makes multiple jokes about how the show looked and sounded differently in the pilot, the different animation style, the character voices, the narrative structure, but it also contains a specific visual Easter egg in the background of the original episode's living room scene, a glimpse of what the Griffin's television was showing, which connects to real-world broadcast history in a way that rewards viewers who remember what was actually on television in 1999. The episode also makes a pointed joke about the show's awareness of its own cutaway dependency. When Brian and Stewie observe the characters in the original episode while a cutaway is happening, the characters are shown standing in the room doing nothing, just waiting, awkwardly, for the cutaway to end so they can continue their scene. The joke is about the structural absurdity of cutaways from the character's perspective, which the show had never directly addressed before. It is simultaneously funny and a fair piece of self-criticism. And it works because it requires the viewer to think about how the show's narrative mechanics actually function from an in-universe perspective. The Simpsons crossover episode from Season 13 is extraordinarily dense with Easter eggs, many of them operating at the level of animation history rather than narrative. The episode aired in 2014, and the production team clearly spent considerable time making it a showcase for inside jokes about both shows and their relationship to each other. When Peter and Homer engage in a prolonged fight scene, the sequence is deliberately modeled on the structure of Peter's fights with the giant chicken, which is itself a reference. Since viewers who know Family Guy know exactly what that structure means and what it tends to involve, the Simpsons crossover episode used Family Guy's own visual language to comment on the Family Guy versus Simpsons cultural rivalry, embedding the commentary inside the comedy. In the same episode, Roger from American Dad appears briefly and then immediately leaves when he realizes he is in a Fox television universe, where his show is no longer being broadcast on the network. This is a remarkably dense single gag. Roger's presence is the first Easter egg, connecting the Family Guy and American Dad universes in a way that had been done occasionally but never quite so directly. His quick departure is the second Easter egg, commenting on the fact that American Dad had been moved from Fox to the cable network TBS. The whole thing happens in a few seconds and requires you to know both shows and the real-world story of American Dad's network migration to fully unpack it. The period between Season 8 and Season 15 also saw the development of what you might call the second-generation Easter egg tradition in the show. Hidden details that referenced not just external pop culture but the show's own history, callbacks to first-season details, revisitations of early character moments, references to specific past episodes that required the viewer to have watched the show for many years to recognize. This self-referential layer was partly a function of the show's age by this point. It had accumulated enough history to mine, and partly a choice by the writing staff to reward loyalty in their audience. The recurring giant chicken fights, for instance, became Easter eggs in their own right as they accumulated. Each new chicken fight episode contained specific visual references to earlier chicken fight episodes, borrowed choreography, specific backgrounds that echoed earlier settings, the same kind of damage being done to the same kinds of environments. Fans who had cataloged the fights could spot these references and feel that the show was acknowledging them. The fights became a conversation across seasons, each new installment commenting on and extending the history of the ones before it. During the Road to episodes of this period, the writing team continued to embed deep-cut musical references. The Road to episodes were always structured partly as homages to the Bob Hope and Bing Crosby road pictures of the 1940s, and the music used in them was frequently sourced from or modeled on the kind of material Hope and Crosby performed. But within those musical numbers, the arrangements sometimes contained nods to entirely different musical traditions, jazz standards rearranged in unusual ways, classical passages tucked inside what sounded like Broadway numbers, folk melodies transformed into something more contemporary. These were not obvious enough to distract from the entertainment, but were detectable enough to reward listeners with musical training. Section 11. The Multiverse, Time Travel, and the Hidden Lore. One of the most interesting things about Family Guy's creative history is that the show has, across its run, built something that functions almost like a mythology, a set of internally consistent, or at least consistently referenced rules about how its universe works, what powers exist within it, and what the history of the world looks like from the perspective of the characters who live there. This mythology is not explicit. The show never sits down and explains it, but it is legible to viewers who have watched enough of the show and paid enough attention to the accumulated details. The centerpiece of this hidden lore is Stewie's time machine. From the moment Stewie is established in Season 1 as a character who builds advanced technology, the time machine is present as a world-shaping element of the Family Guy universe. In Season 1's Mind Over Murder, Stewie builds a machine that generates a time dilation field. By Season 7, he has developed full temporal displacement capability. The progression from time manipulation to time travel is never formally explained, but it traces a logical development path for a character whose ingenuity is supposed to be unlimited. The rules of time travel in the Family Guy universe are more internally consistent than casual viewers generally appreciate. The show does not use time travel as a magic reset button. Rather, the episodes that involve time travel consistently adhere to a version of the rules in which changes to the past create branching timelines rather than altering the present. In Road to Germany, when Mort Goldman accidentally travels back to September 1939, the day of the Nazi invasion of Poland, and the ensuing events create a significant alteration to history, the resolution requires going back and actively undoing the change, rather than simply returning to the present and finding everything as it was. The show understood that meaningful time travel stories required genuine consequences and genuine corrective effort. Back to the Pilot extends this logic by demonstrating what happens when characters from the show's future interact with its past. When Brian and Stewie visit the first episode and Brian's time travel decisions create a chain of consequences affecting the show's decade-long history, the episode is essentially arguing that the events of the early seasons were not arbitrary. They had a causal logic that continued to shape the show's development. Whether this was a sincere argument about the show's internal consistency or a meta-joke about how little internal consistency the show actually had, the episode treats its premise with enough seriousness that the resulting paradoxes feel earned rather than lazy. The Road to the Multiverse episode is the most comprehensive articulation of the Family Guy universe's cosmological rules. Stewie's multiverse remote control allows him and Brian to visit parallel versions of their own universe, where specific historical variables have been changed. The episode visits a universe where Christianity never developed, allowing science to advance unimpeded through the period that produced the European Dark Ages, resulting in a version of Quahog that is futuristic, clean, and high technology. It visits a universe where the Japanese won World War II, depicted in an anime animation style. It visits a universe run by dogs where humans are pets. It visits a Disney animated universe, and a version rendered in low-resolution video game graphics, and a robot chicken stop-motion version. Each universe contains hidden details that reward specific knowledge. The Disney universe's visual style is accurate enough to function as a genuine Disney parody, capturing the specific look of mid-century Disney feature animation. The anime universe is accurate enough to function as a genuine shoujo and shonen anime parody simultaneously, with the character designs shifting to reflect the visual conventions of both styles. The low-resolution video game universe references specific aesthetic choices from early 1990s console games that only players of that era would recognize. Each version of the world is an Easter egg for viewers who know that world's visual language. The multiverse episode also contains a detail that was likely unintentional, but has become one of the most discussed pieces of Family Guy hidden lore. When Stewie and Brian visit the robot chicken version of the universe, the animation style shifts to stop motion, and the characters explicitly comment on it, expressing confusion about their own changed appearance. This is standard meta-comedy, but when they visit the Disney universe and sing a musical number in the Disney style, the song they perform, It's a Wonderful Day for Pie, is written and arranged in a style that is accurate enough to the Disney musical tradition to function as both parody and genuine homage. The song has been noted by music fans as a surprisingly accomplished piece of pastiche, capturing the specific harmonic and melodic conventions of Golden Age Disney musicals with a level of craft that suggests real musical knowledge on the part of whoever wrote it. Stewie's time machine in the Life of Brian era was noted to have been destroyed, a narrative decision that carries enormous weight in the show's internal mythology. When Stewie crushes the machine in the junkyard, he is not just making a plot choice. He is removing from the Family Guy universe its most powerful single object, the device that had allowed the show to visit the past, the future, and alternate timelines. The destruction of the time machine was, from a world-building perspective, a significant event, and its restoration achieved through the clever paradox of borrowing from a past version of Stewie demonstrated that the show's internal mythology had rules specific enough to generate plot solutions. The time machine's return was not arbitrary. It required a specific set of circumstances to make possible, and those circumstances were generated by the same event that made the machine's restoration necessary. The Family Guy universe also has a mythology around death that the show has largely avoided addressing directly, but has encoded in specific moments across the series. The world of the show has a god who has appeared as a character. It has a version of heaven. It has a version of hell. It has angels. These supernatural elements have been deployed sporadically, as the occasion demands, but their appearances have been consistent enough to suggest a coherent theological framework underlying the comedy. In the episodes where God appears, certain things are always true. God is not omnipotent in any simple sense. He has preferences and a sense of humor, and the rules of his universe are sometimes negotiable. The death character, the personified Grim Reaper who appears in several early episodes, represents another element of the show's hidden lore. Death in the Family Guy universe is characterized as overworked, emotionally exhausted, and in need of a vacation. His appearances in the early seasons established a set of rules about how death functions in this world, rules that the show subsequently ignored when it was convenient to do so. The fact that death exists and is accessible to Peter means that death itself, in this universe, is a personified bureaucratic entity rather than a natural force, which in turn means that the deaths of characters are always potentially negotiable. This theological framework was planted in the early seasons and never fully developed, but it was referenced often enough to qualify as hidden lore. The in-universe question of whether the Griffin family is aware that they exist within a television show has been addressed multiple times across the series in ways that suggest the writers could never quite decide on an answer. In Inside Family Guy, the show explicitly depicts the Griffins as characters on a TV show who are aware of their fictional status. In Cutaway Land, the Cutaway universe is treated as a physical place that characters can enter. In Back to the Pilot, Brian and Stewie interact with their own past. All of these episodes nudge the show toward a specific metafictional position the world of Family Guy is aware of itself. But in the vast majority of episodes, the characters operate with no such awareness, treating their reality as fully real. The show cannot commit to either position and so occupies both simultaneously, which is actually a kind of hidden philosophical position. The Family Guy universe is both real and fictional depending on which episode you are watching. Section 12. Final Secrets, Closing Mysteries, and the Legacy of Hidden Detail. We have covered a great deal of ground tonight. Easter eggs from the first season through the latest ones, character inconsistencies that span 20 years of storytelling, animation errors that made it to broadcast despite everything, hidden references that required deep knowledge of Star Wars, Stanley Kubrick, literary fiction, production history, and the internal mythology of the show itself. All of it together forms a portrait of Family Guy that is more complicated, more layered, and more interesting than the popular perception of the show tends to allow for. That popular perception of a show that simply throws jokes at the wall and does not much care what sticks is not without foundation. The show's later seasons in particular gave critics substantial material with which to argue that carelessness and laziness had become defining characteristics of the production. But the Easter egg tradition tells a different story, or at least complicates the dominant one. A show that embeds the working title of Return of the Jedi into its episode title, that hides literary references inside background characters who appear for 2 seconds in a crowd scene, that uses the books on a character's bookshelf to document that character's psychological decline, that is a show with at least some people in the room who care deeply about the work, who are putting thought and craft into things that most viewers will never notice. The tension between those two realities, the careless and the meticulous existing in the same production, is perhaps the most honest characterization of Family Guy as a creative enterprise. It is a show that contains genuine genius and genuine laziness in proportions that have varied across its history. The Easter eggs are the fingerprints of the genius. The continuity errors and character inconsistencies are the fingerprints of the laziness. Both sets of fingerprints are real. Neither one cancels out the other. There are mysteries that remain genuinely unresolved. The unnamed background character that fans call Holden Caulfield, was he always the same character across all his appearances? Or was he independently invented by different animators on different episodes who happened to arrive at a similar design? The show has never officially clarified. Some writers have acknowledged the Catcher in the Rye reference was intentional, but the character's appearances in multiple episodes suggests either a consistent Easter egg strategy or multiple independent convergences on the same visual idea. The question of what Stewie can actually hear, which adults can understand him, and which cannot, and whether this has ever been definitively established remains open. The show has played with this ambiguity for so many seasons that it has effectively become permanent. Resolving it would remove a source of comedy that the writers have found too useful to abandon. The exact origin of Brian within the Griffin family remains multiply contradicted across the show's run. There is no single canonical account that harmonizes all the different tellings, and the show has shown no particular interest in producing one. Brian's backstory exists in a state of productive ambiguity, which allows individual episodes to access it in whatever form best serves their story without being constrained by the need to match a single definitive account. Seth MacFarlane's personal life has embedded itself in the show in ways that range from the direct and acknowledged to the oblique and probably unconscious. MacFarlane's survival of the September 11th attacks he was scheduled to be on American Airlines Flight 11 out of Boston, the first plane to hit the World Trade Center, but missed the flight because his travel agent gave him the wrong departure time, and because he was hungover from the night before, is not exactly a secret. He has discussed it in interviews. But the way the show has approached the attacks across multiple episodes, including back to the pilot, carries a weight that connects to that personal history in ways that are felt rather than stated. A man who survived that particular morning by chance carries it differently than someone who only knows it from news coverage. MacFarlane's relationship with Fox, which became increasingly strained in the later years, and which he addressed publicly and sometimes bluntly, is also legible in the show's content if you know where to look. The episodes that contain jokes about Fox as a network, that make reference to the show's precarious relationship with its broadcaster, that occasionally had characters break the fourth wall to comment on their situation within the Fox programming lineup. These are moments where the creator's real-world frustrations made it onto the screen, disguised as comedy but visible to anyone who followed the story of MacFarlane's public statements about his desire to work elsewhere. The show's relationship with its own longevity has produced some of its most quietly honest Easter eggs. Episodes that acknowledge the show has been running for a long time, that make jokes about the characters never aging, that reference the improbability of a fictional Rhode Island family remaining so consistently eventful across so many years. These are moments of genuine self-awareness about what it means to be a show that has outlasted the world in which it was created. Family Guy premiered before smartphones, before social media, before streaming, before the cultural landscape that exists today. It has continued into a world that the show of 1999 could not have imagined, and the Easter eggs that acknowledge this, that make the show aware of its own historical position, are perhaps the most interesting ones of all. The hidden details in Family Guy are, at their best, evidence of love. They are evidence that people who cared about this show deeply enough to put things in it that most viewers would never find. That is a particular kind of love, the love of a craftsperson who does careful work in places no one will look, because the quality of the work matters to them, regardless of whether it is seen. The Easter eggs that were planted in seasons 1, 2, and 3 and are still being discovered by attentive viewers today are the clearest evidence that Family Guy was created by people who genuinely believed in what they were making. The continuity errors and the character inconsistencies are evidence of something else, of the industrial pressures that act on any creative enterprise that operates at the volume and pace of commercial American television. They are not evidence of malice or indifference. They are evidence of the basic mathematical reality that making 22 episodes per year across more than 2 decades, with hundreds of contributors across multiple continents, is a process that no human system can manage without some degradation of consistency. Both kinds of evidence are real. Both tell you true things about the show. And the fact that you can hold both simultaneously appreciating the genius in the details while acknowledging the failures in the continuity is actually the most sophisticated relationship you can have with a piece of art. This large and this imperfect. Family Guy rewards that sophisticated relationship. It always has. The Easter eggs are still being found. Long after episodes air, long after they appear on streaming platforms, long after the cultural conversation has moved on to whatever came next, viewers are still pausing specific frames, zooming in on background details, reading signs on walls and license plates on cars, and spines of books on shelves. They are finding things that were put there years ago by people who hoped someone would eventually look. The joy of that discovery, small and private, and shared in comment sections with strangers who experienced the same thing, is what the Easter egg tradition is ultimately about. It is the show's way of saying, we were here, we cared. We put something in this frame that was made specifically for you, for the viewer who was paying close enough attention to find it. The show that turned its creator into a household name, that survived 2 cancellations, that generated debates about the nature of animated comedy and the ethics of certain kinds of humor, that was renewed for what may eventually be its 30th anniversary. That show contains within it all these little sealed messages. Quiet, patient, waiting, go back and look. You will find them. If this relaxed you tonight, if it helped you drift off to somewhere more peaceful, then do the most helpful thing you can do for this channel and hit that like button. Every single one of those matters more than you might think. Subscribe if you have not already, so you will be here for the next one. And drop a comment telling me which Easter egg from tonight surprised you the most. Rest well. I will see you in the next one. End of script. Estimated word count to 30,200 words. Expanded section 2 continued. The pilot and the language of hidden detail. What is worth dwelling on when you think about those earliest episodes is the specific atmosphere that McFarlane and his team were trying to create. Family Guy in 1999 was competing for attention in a television landscape that included The Simpsons, already a full decade old and culturally dominant, as well as South Park, which had launched in 1997 and immediately carved out a different kind of animated comedy space, one built on transgression and political irreverence. Family Guy needed to be something that occupied its own territory, and the way it found that territory was through a very specific combination of pop culture knowledge and domestic warmth. The Easter eggs in those early episodes served both of those goals simultaneously. A hidden shining reference in Stewie's building blocks told the viewer, "This show knows its cinema. This show assumes you know your cinema too. This show is speaking to you as a peer rather than talking down to you." And that assumption of the audience's intelligence was itself a kind of intimacy. A show that treats you as smart is a show you want to spend time with. At the same time, those hidden details were always embedded in the texture of domestic life. The blocks on the nursery floor, the books on the shelf, the posters on Meg's bedroom wall, the writing on the refrigerator. These were the ordinary objects of family life, and the Easter eggs were woven into them rather than standing apart from them. You did not have to pause for an elaborate set piece. You just had to notice that the ordinary objects of this ordinary family's house contained extraordinary small jokes. The very first season also established several recurring visual jokes that functioned as ongoing Easter eggs across the show's history. The Drunken Clam, the bar where the male characters spent much of their leisure time, had specific visual elements that the show returned to repeatedly. The arrangement of bottles behind the bar changed between episodes, but certain specific details remained consistent: a particular sign, a particular piece of bar furniture that gave attentive viewers the feeling of a place they genuinely knew. This is how great set design works in any visual medium, by providing enough consistent detail that the space feels like a real place while also leaving enough room for variation that each visit to the space reveals something new. The exterior of the Griffin's house on Spooner Street was another element that accumulated hidden meaning across the seasons. The house itself is unremarkable, by design a generic suburban Cape Cod that could belong to any lower middle-class family in any New England town. But the neighborhood around it changed subtly across episodes, with different houses on the street appearing and disappearing, different cars and different driveways, different landscaping choices. The neighborhood was never fully consistent, but the Griffin house itself maintained a specific visual identity that grounded it. What is interesting about the early seasons is that they were made by a team that genuinely did not know if the show would last. The first cancellation came after just 3 seasons. When you are making a show that might be canceled at any moment, you make choices about what to invest in. The writers of Family Guy's early seasons chose to invest in depth in character detail, in hidden reference, in the kind of specificity that builds loyalty. They were not making a show designed to be watched once and discarded. They were making a show designed to be watched again, and the Easter eggs were the primary vehicle for that rewatchability. The episode Peter Peter Caviar Eater from Season 2 demonstrates this philosophy particularly clearly. The episode follows the Griffin family receiving an inheritance from Lois's aunt and briefly joining the upper class, only to lose everything through Peter's characteristic recklessness. On one level, it is a simple class comedy. On another level, it is packed with background details, signage in the Newport estate, objects in the drawing room, references on the dinner table that respond to the episode's themes with a precision the main narrative cannot always achieve. A dinner party scene, visible only in the background of one shot, contains a seating arrangement that tells you exactly what the creators thought about the relationship between old money and social pretension, told entirely through which characters are seated next to which objects. The show's pilot also contains an element that is less an Easter egg than a founding creative decision, but one that has never been fully discussed. The choice to set Family Guy in Rhode Island rather than in a more obviously suburban or Midwestern location. Most animated family sitcoms set themselves in generic American locations that could be anywhere. Springfield in The Simpsons is deliberately placeless, a composite of American small-town identity. Family Guy chose Rhode Island, the smallest state in the Union, with a specific geography and culture and history. The choice has paid off across the seasons in the form of small Rhode Island-specific references, the particular culture of a small, historically significant East Coast state that function as Easter eggs for anyone who knows that territory and recognizes the accuracy of the details. Expanded Section 3. More continuity mistakes and the deeper problems. The Peter Griffin backstory contradiction involving his biological father deserves much more attention than it typically receives, because it represents a fascinating case study in how long-running serialized fiction handles the conflict between new story opportunities and established canon. When Francis Griffin was introduced, the show built an entire relationship around him and Peter, a complicated, fraught father-son dynamic rooted in religious and cultural conservatism. Francis represented everything Peter was not: rigid, humorless, demanding, ideologically certain. The comedy of their scenes together came from this contrast, and it worked consistently enough that Francis was brought back multiple times. He became part of the fabric of the show. When Francis died in a later season, it was treated as a genuine loss, an event with real emotional weight for Peter and for the audience. And then the show revealed that Francis was not Peter's biological father. Mickey McFinnigan, an Irish drunk, was the biological parent. This revelation created a retroactive paradox that the show was unwilling or unable to resolve. If Mickey is Peter's biological father, what does that mean for every scene Peter and Francis ever had? Does their relationship, now revealed to be adoptive rather than biological, change meaning? Does Peter's religious upbringing, overseen by a man who was not his blood father, feel different? The show asked these questions briefly in the McFinnigan episode and then declined to answer them in any sustained way. What is interesting here is not the mistake itself, but the impulse that created it. The writers encountered a story that seemed interesting. Peter's real father is alive and different from everything he has known, and ran with it without fully tracking the consequences for existing canon. This is not laziness so much as the natural tendency of television writing to prioritize the present story over the accumulated history, to choose what would be interesting to explore now over what is consistent with everything we have established before. The Bonnie Swanson pregnancy is the most extreme example of this tendency in the show's entire run, and it deserves a more detailed examination. Bonnie was introduced in Season 1 as Joe's wife, visibly and unmistakably pregnant. Her pregnancy was not a passing detail, it was a characterization choice, a way to mark Bonnie as a domestic figure in contrast to Joe's more adventurous identity. But then the season ended, and Season 2 began, and Bonnie was still pregnant. Season 3 began. Bonnie was still pregnant. Season 4. Season 5. Bonnie had been pregnant for 5 seasons and several real-world years. Within the show, attempts were made to address this. Characters occasionally commented on the length of Bonnie's pregnancy, treating it as an acknowledged absurdity. This is the show being meta-aware about a mistake without actually correcting it. A choice that is both funny and epistemologically interesting, because a show that laughs at its own continuity errors is acknowledging that consistency is not something it is fully committed to as a creative value. The laugh about Bonnie's pregnancy is a hidden admission that the show's relationship with real-world time and consequence is complicated at best. When Bonnie finally gave birth, the show treated it as a significant event, a long-awaited resolution to an ongoing situation. The baby, a daughter named Susie, became a recurring character, but the birth raised its own set of continuity questions. If Bonnie had been pregnant for 5 or 6 years of showtime, what does that mean for Susie's existence? The show glossed past this, choosing the easiest narrative option. The baby exists, Bonnie recovered, and the pregnancy was filed away as a completed chapter. The Stewie age problem, as discussed earlier, connects to a broader philosophical question about animated sitcoms and the nature of time within them. When The Simpsons began in 1989, Bart was 10 years old. As of the mid-2020s, Bart is still 10 years old. This is not a mistake. It is a deliberate choice about the kind of world The Simpsons inhabits. A kind of eternal present in which events accumulate but characters do not age. Family Guy inherited this tradition but applied it inconsistently, which is actually worse than applying it consistently. If Stewie never ages and the children never age, the show at least has a coherent internal logic. But if Meg ages while Stewie does not, and Chris ages slower than Meg, and the aging happens at different rates in different episodes, then there is no coherent logic, just a series of individual choices that happen to be incompatible with each other when viewed together. The Chris Griffin characterization across the seasons contains its own set of inconsistencies that are less famous than Peter's Flanderization but equally real. Early Chris was a specific kind of character, awkward, adolescent, creatively interested in art and drawing, with a specific interior life that his family largely ignored. He was the kind of kid who noticed things and processed them slowly, who had genuine opinions about the world despite his difficulty expressing them. The character was consistent enough in the early seasons to feel real. As the show progressed, Chris's specific interior life was increasingly replaced by more generalized gag content. His art-making tendency was brought up when an episode needed it and ignored when it did not. His adolescent social struggles, which had been a consistent source of early-season character content, became less systematically explored. What remained was a figure defined primarily by slowness and gullibility, the characteristics that were most useful for generating comedy, at the expense of the more specific details that had made him feel like a person. Quagmire's characterization has its own internal inconsistency that the show has almost certainly never tried to reconcile. Early Quagmire was a joke about a specific kind of mid-century masculine sexual bravado, a throwback to the era of Rat Pack-style womanizing, a character who lived in a fundamentally different moral universe than the one around him. His catchphrase and his behavior were exaggerated to the point of obvious comedy, clearly positioned as a parody of a type rather than a realistic depiction of a person. But as the seasons progressed, the show began asking Quagmire to do more emotionally complex work, to be angry about Brian, to have genuine feelings about certain situations, to function as a moral voice in the Quagmire speech and similar moments. These demands required a different kind of character than the one established in the early seasons. A cartoon womanizer cannot make a credible accusation of moral hypocrisy without the audience wondering why this particular person is the one delivering it. The show tried to thread this needle with varying degrees of success across many seasons, never quite managing to make Quagmire both his original comedic self and a character capable of genuine moral weight simultaneously. Expanded Section 4. Stewie's Hidden Messages. The Deeper Dive. The character of Stewie Griffin generated Easter eggs in categories that no other character in the show quite matched, partly because of the specific nature of his secret interior life, and partly because McFarlane committed to voicing him with a degree of consistency and intelligence that made every Stewie line feel considered. Consider the architectural detail of Stewie's nursery. In the early seasons, the room is designed as a genuine nursery crib, changing table, toys, with the incongruous addition of equipment and weaponry that Stewie has hidden inside ordinary baby furniture. A rattle that is actually a communications device. A stuffed animal that conceals a weapon. The ordinary objects of infant life concealing the extraordinary objects of an evil genius's workshop. The Easter eggs here are almost too literal. They are the show making its fundamental joke. The baby is not what he appears, visible in the room's architecture. But the nursery also contains background details that are less central to the main joke and more quietly interesting. In several early season episodes, if you look at the mobile hanging over Stewie's crib, the objects suspended from it are not the generic baby shapes that a mass-market mobile would carry. They are, in various episodes, tiny models of spacecraft, mathematical symbols, architectural elements. Someone either in the writer's room or in the art department made the decision that Stewie's mobile would reflect his interests rather than his developmental stage. It is a small choice that rewards attention and adds depth to the character without ever being called out in the dialogue. The weapons and devices that Stewie builds across the series contain their own layer of Easter eggs for science fiction fans. His various ray guns are designed with aesthetic elements borrowed from multiple science fiction traditions: the Flash Gordon serials, the science fiction films of the 1950s, the more stylized visual language of animated science fiction from the 1960s and 1970s. If you know the visual history of science fiction, Stewie's weapons function as a guided tour through it. His time machine draws from H.G. Wells. His mind control devices reference the brain from Pinky and the Brain and similar animated villain precedents. His weather control devices echo the classic mad scientist equipment of Universal horror films. The most sophisticated piece of Stewie-related Easter egg work in the entire series is arguably the Stewie-Brian dynamic itself, which was built over multiple seasons through the accumulation of small details that gradually constructed a genuine friendship between two characters who had no reason to be close. In Season 1, Brian and Stewie barely interacted. The early show positioned Peter and Brian as the central friendship, the dynamic that drove most of the plots, and generated most of the comedy. Stewie was largely a solo act, pursuing his own schemes with commentary delivered mostly to himself. The early episodes where Brian and Stewie share scenes tend to have them in parallel, rather than in dialogue Stewie doing his thing while Brian watches, or vice versa. But even in those early episodes, attentive viewers could detect something building. When Brian did engage with Stewie directly when he acknowledged Stewie's plans, responded to his dialogue, treated him as a genuine conversational partner, the dynamic had a different quality than anything else in the show. It was warmer, less transactional. The two characters seemed to genuinely like each other even before the show formally committed to their friendship as a narrative element. The accumulation of this before the Road to Rhode Island episode in Season 2, the first fully realized Brian-Stewie adventure, means that when the episode aired, their friendship felt earned rather than declared. The Easter egg was the slow build, the quiet detail work across multiple earlier episodes that laid the groundwork for something the show had not yet officially announced. The Road to Rhode Island episode itself, where Brian and Stewie travel across the country to retrieve Stewie from a summer camp, is packed with Easter eggs on top of its basic narrative. The title is an explicit reference to The Road to, films of Bob Hope and Bing Crosby, a Hollywood tradition from the 1940s, where Hope and Crosby played characters who bickered, got into trouble, and performed musical numbers while traveling to exotic locations. Family Guy used this template as the organizing structure for what became the show's most beloved recurring format. The connection to Hope and Crosby is the foundational Easter egg of the entire Road to series, and it sets up a secondary layer of Easter eggs in every subsequent installment because once you know the tradition being referenced, you can track exactly which specific Hope Crosby tropes each Road to episode is deploying and subverting. In Road to Rhode Island, the musical number My Road to Rhode Island is an homage to My Favorite Things from The Sound of Music and simultaneously a riff on Road to Morocco, the song that Hope and Crosby performed in their 1942 film, Road to Morocco. The song does both things at once. It is genuinely in the tradition of the Golden Age musical it is parodying, while also being specifically about the characters singing it. The layering of references is itself the Easter egg. The joke is in knowing what is being referenced, and the depth of the reference rewards proportionally deeper knowledge. Stewie's later development, the transition from evil genius to emotionally complex child, generated a different kind of hidden detail. As the evil genius elements receded, they were not simply replaced by nothing. They were replaced by emotional content that had always been latent in the character, but subordinated to the comedy of his villainy. The vulnerability beneath the megalomaniac was always there. The specific affection Stewie had for Brian, despite his stated indifference, was always there. The episodes of the middle seasons that explored this emotional interior were not creating something new. They were excavating something that had been present since Season 1, in the background, visible to viewers who looked carefully enough. Expanded Section 5. Brian and the Autobiographical Egg. The concept of the autobiographical Easter egg, the moment where a creator puts something personal into their work in a way that is visible to those who know them, but not to the general audience, is one of the most interesting categories in the entire hidden detail tradition. And Brian Griffin is the primary vehicle for this in Family Guy. Seth MacFarlane has spoken in various interviews about his experiences as a young writer trying to break into the entertainment industry, about the gap between ambition and output that defines the early career of any creative person, about the particular frustration of working in commercial entertainment, when what you want to do is make something more personal and more lasting. All of these experiences are refracted through Brian Griffin in ways that are not quite confessional. They are shaped and distorted by comedy, by the needs of the character, by the requirements of an animated sitcom, but they are recognizable as personal history once you know where to look. The specific form that Brian's creative failure takes a novel that has been in progress for years and never reaches completion is a particularly pointed autobiographical reference. MacFarlane is known as a highly productive creator in the industrial sense. He has created multiple television series, written and directed films, recorded albums, hosted award shows, but the creative work that requires sustained personal investment rather than collaborative production, the equivalent of the novel, has not been a prominent part of his public output. Brian's inability to finish his book, despite his genuine belief in his talent and his real desire to produce something meaningful, reads as a meditation on the gap between the professional creator and the personal artist, a gap that McFarlane understood from the inside. The Brian episode that most clearly reads as autobiographical Easter egg is Brian's play from season 11. In this episode, Brian writes a one-act play, and it receives encouraging feedback from family and friends. Stewie then reads it and produces a withering, comprehensive critique of everything that is wrong with it, its derivative structure, its emotional falseness, its reliance on borrowed language rather than original insight. Brian is devastated. The episode ends with Stewie producing his own play, which is clearly far superior, and Brian acknowledging that the gap between what he believed about his work and what it actually was, measured against a genuinely talented peer, is enormous. The Easter egg in this episode operates at the level of the creative process rather than at the level of pop culture reference. It is a hidden commentary on the psychology of the aspiring artist, specifically the way that creative ambition can outrun actual ability, and the particular pain of having that gap revealed by someone who does not intend to be cruel, but simply cannot pretend the gap is not there. That psychological reality is embedded inside a comedy episode in a way that the casual viewer experiences as humor, but that the viewer who has gone through something similar experiences as something more like recognition. The episode also contains a structural Easter egg in the way it handles the actual text of the plays. Brian's play is summarized rather than quoted, described rather than performed. Stewie's play is similarly handled. We are told it is brilliant rather than shown the brilliance in detail. This choice keeps the episode in the register of comedy rather than genuine artistic drama, but it also means that the episode's Easter egg for the careful viewer is in the gap between what we are told about the plays and what we actually see. We are being asked to imagine the work, which is what you always have to do when art exists inside other art and cannot be made fully real. Brian's drinking across the series is another autobiographical thread worth following, and it functions as its own running Easter egg for viewers who track character behavior across episodes. In the early seasons, Brian's drinking was characterized with a specific quality. He drank martinis with the manner of someone who had sophisticated taste, but the quantity of his drinking and the occasional desperation behind it suggested that the sophistication was partly a mask for something less controlled. The martini was the Easter egg, a drink that signals refinement, but that, consumed to excess, reveals the same compulsive relationship with alcohol as any other. Brian was using a sophisticated vehicle for something not sophisticated at all. As the seasons progressed, the details of Brian's drinking shifted in ways that tracked with his overall character decline. The martini glass appeared less. He was shown drinking at more irregular times, in more contexts, with less of the performed elegance that had defined the early season version of the habit. The drinking became more visible precisely as it became less aesthetically managed, and that visibility was itself a hidden story about Brian's deterioration, told not through dialogue or explicit plot, but through the specific prop a character holds in his hand in the background of scenes. Expanded Section 7 continued. Animation Errors as Archaeology. The Animation Error Database for Family Guy, assembled across multiple fan wikis and dedicated cataloging websites, is genuinely remarkable in its completeness. People have spent hundreds of hours with paused video and frame-by-frame analysis, documenting every case where an eyebrow disappeared, a prop changed color, a room contradicted itself, or a character's position in space shifted between shots. This collective effort is its own kind of hidden detail, a community of viewers so committed to understanding the show that they built reference archives for its mistakes. What the database reveals, when you look at it as a whole, is that the errors cluster in specific ways. The early seasons have a particular kind of mistake, small, physical, the kind that results from teams learning to work together and from the specific challenges of traditional animation methods. The middle seasons have a different kind. Digital artifacts, the byproduct of transitioning from hand-drawn to computer-assisted techniques, where the tools created new categories of impossibility. The later seasons have their own profile. The errors of fatigue and volume, the kind that come from producing too much content too quickly with too few people dedicated to catching problems before broadcast. The first major animation transition in the show's history happened between the first 3 seasons and the revival 4th season in 2005. The show's original animation style, handled by Rough Draft Studios for seasons 2 and 3, had a specific quality that fans described as loose characters, moved in ways that felt slightly improvised, with expressions that pushed beyond the model sheets in ways that gave scenes energy. The cleaner style of the revival era was technically more precise but lost something in that precision. The Easter egg for animation historians is in comparing scenes from the two eras and noticing exactly where the energy went. The Rough Draft Studios episodes contained specific visual signatures that attentive fans could identify a slight shimmering quality to the line work, a tendency to push character expressions to extremes that the later, cleaner style reined in, a richness in background painting that the more efficient digital production methods of the revival era traded away for consistency and speed. None of this was visible to casual viewers. All of it was visible to the kind of viewer who knew animation well enough to understand that different studios make fundamentally different choices, and that those choices affect what the characters feel like from the inside. One of the most technically interesting animation errors in the show's history is the Room 105 corridor mistake, where the room number switches sides of the hallway between shots. This error is interesting not just as a mistake, but as a window into how animation production works. The corridor was almost certainly designed once as a specific piece of background art, with Room 105 on a specific side. But when the sequence was shot when different camera angles on the characters walking down the corridor were animated, the background art was either flopped, reversed for one of the shots without updating the room number, or different animators worked on shots without the same background reference. The result is a hallway that physically cannot exist, with a room that occupies both sides simultaneously. In a live-action production, this error would almost certainly have been caught because the actual set exists in physical space and has a specific geometry that the camera crew cannot ignore. In animation, the set is redrawn for every shot, which means errors of spatial continuity can slip through more easily. The Room 105 corridor mistake is the clearest possible example of the specific vulnerability that animation has to this category of error. Expanded Section 8 continued. More deep-cut references. The cultural reference density in Family Guy's best episodes, particularly in the early and middle seasons, is genuinely staggering when you start to catalog it. An episode might contain primary narrative references, secondary background references, audio references in what is playing on televisions or radios within scenes, visual references in the design of props and clothing and environments, and structural references in the way scenes are blocked and edited to echo specific films or television episodes. All of these operate simultaneously, at different levels of visibility, creating a layered reading experience that rewards different amounts of knowledge. The All in the Family homage, which involved Family Guy recreating the visual style and some of the structural elements of Norman Lear's landmark 1970s sitcom, was one of the most carefully constructed structural Easter eggs in the show's history. To get the homage right, the animators had to understand not just the content of All in the Family, but its aesthetic, the specific multi-camera sitcom visual language of the era, the way scenes were staged in a naturalistic living room setting, the particular rhythm of the dialogue. The result was an episode segment that looked genuinely different from the surrounding content, a deliberate stylistic excursion that doubled as a tribute. The deeper Easter egg in the All in the Family homage is in the choice of what to homage. All in the Family was a show that used the comedy of a bigoted, reactionary, working-class patriarch to examine and critique the prejudices of its era. The show was not celebrating Archie Bunker, it was putting his worldview on screen so that viewers could see it clearly and react to it. The parallel with Peter Griffin, who operates in some of the same comedic territory as Archie Bunker, is not accidental. By explicitly invoking All in the Family, Family Guy was acknowledging its lineage and staking a claim to that tradition, while also inviting the comparison and all the pressure it puts on Peter as a character. The Silence of the Lambs Buffalo Bill reference we discussed in the Seth Green context is part of a broader tradition in Family Guy of using horror film references to add tonal contrast to otherwise domestic scenes. Horror references appear throughout the show's history in moments where the surface content is not horrifying, but where the hidden reference brings a darker register into the frame. Stewie's redrum blocks are the clearest example. The various Hitchcock homages that appear in the show's cinematography, specific camera angles, specific shot compositions that echo Psycho or Vertigo are another. The Wilhelm scream appears enough times throughout Family Guy that finding it has become a game for viewers who know what to listen for. The scream has appeared in episodes across multiple seasons, always in moments of physical comedy where a character experiences sudden injury or fall. The joke is always the same: a sound effect that carries the weight of film history, used in a cartoon context that domesticates it. For viewers who recognize the Wilhelm, every instance is a small, private delight, a shared secret between the show and the attentive viewer, proof that someone in the sound department knows their film history and enjoys hiding it in the mix. The John Williams nomination in the Adult Film Award sequence from Brian Does Hollywood deserves more attention than it has typically received, because it operates on multiple levels of reference simultaneously. John Williams is, by any measure, the most commercially successful film composer of the modern era. His scores for Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Jaws, E.T., Schindler's List, and dozens of other films have made him one of the most recognized names in cinema. Placing him as a nominee for a pornographic film's musical composition is funny because of the incongruity: the most respectable creative figure in mainstream Hollywood film appearing in the least respectable context. But it is also funny because of what the joke implies about the relationship between high art and low commerce, about the way that talent and prestige get deployed in the service of entertainment that exists outside the cultural spaces where prestige is usually valued. The other nominees in that sequence, Ron Jones and Walter Murphy, both of whom are real composers who worked on Family Guy's own music, add another layer to the joke. Ron Jones and Walter Murphy are in the real world of Family Guy production, in exactly the way John Williams is in the imaginary world of the Adult Film Awards. By placing them side by side in the same fictional ceremony, the show is simultaneously making a joke about adult films, a joke about its own composers, a joke about John Williams, and a joke about the whole concept of film music as a category of artistic achievement. That density of reference in a single 3-second moment is the standard that the best Family Guy Easter eggs set. Expanded Section 9 continued. More character inconsistencies. The treatment of Meg Griffin's character across the seasons contains inconsistencies that go deeper than the well-documented issue of her abuse escalating beyond what the show ever intended. There are genuine character inconsistencies within Meg moments, where her capabilities, her personality, and her relationships contradict earlier established facts that sit alongside the cruelty as evidence of a character who was never fully developed and therefore could never fully be protected. In the first 2 seasons, Meg had specific personality traits beyond unpopular teenager. She had particular interests. She had a social world at school, however difficult that world was for her. She had opinions about music and culture. She had a relationship with her parents that, while imperfect, was more nuanced than what it later became. These early characterization details made Meg feel like a real, specific person rather than a generic target. As the seasons progressed, these specific details were replaced by a simpler characterization that made her more available for jokes. The specific Meg of Season 1, who had a particular perspective on her own situation that was occasionally funny in its self-awareness, became the generic Meg of Season 6 onward, who existed primarily as a surface for other characters' comedy. The inconsistency is not just that her treatment worsened, it is that her specific character was evacuated to make room for that treatment. A specific person is harder to abuse for laughs than a generic one. The reversal of Meg's characterization in the later seasons, beginning around Season 14 and 15, when the extreme abuse began to pull back and Meg started being given more capable and self-possessed storylines, created a different kind of inconsistency. The Meg who emerged from the later seasons, tougher and more resilient, had no specific narrative path connecting her to the Meg who preceded her. She was simply different, in the way that a reset button produces difference, without the experience of having changed. The inconsistency between the abused Meg and the capable Meg is not the natural inconsistency of character growth. It is the abrupt inconsistency of a production, correcting a mistake without doing the narrative work of showing how. The correction happened. The Joe Swanson disability issue deserves a more nuanced examination than the one we gave it earlier. In the first season, Joe's characterization was built around the specific reality of being a wheelchair user who had not allowed his disability to define or limit him in the ways that others might expect. He was a police officer. He was tough. He was admired. The disability was present and real and visible, but it was framed as one aspect of a person rather than as the primary fact of who that person was. As the show's humor about Joe evolved, the disability became increasingly central to the comedy, and that centrality changed the show's relationship to it. The early Joe was a statement inadvertent or deliberate about disability and capability. The later Joe was a different kind of statement, one that the show's creators probably did not intend, but that follows naturally from the gradual reduction of a character to their most easily exploitable characteristic. The inconsistency is between two philosophies of characterization, one that takes the whole person seriously and one that reduces the person to a single usable element. Meg's various love interests across the seasons represent another category of characterization inconsistency that tends to be overlooked because the love interest episodes are often less celebrated than the episodes that focused on her abuse. In several episodes, Meg was given genuine romantic storylines relationships with specific boys that developed over the course of an episode in ways that felt like real adolescent romance. These episodes treated Meg as a person capable of being loved, of having her feelings taken seriously, of experiencing the normal emotional landscape of teenage life. But these relationships never persisted. They were resolved within their episode and then not referenced in subsequent ones. The boy who genuinely cared about Meg in one episode would be absent from all future episodes, with no explanation of what happened to the relationship. This is standard sitcom practice. Characters introduced for single episodes generally do not return. But in Meg's case, the pattern created an additional layer of sadness. Her positive experiences were as disposable as her negative ones, neither allowed to accumulate into a continuous story. Expanded Section 10 continued. Hidden Gems of the Middle Era. The middle era of Family Guy, roughly seasons 8 through 15, produced some of the most technically sophisticated hidden references in the show's history, even as other elements of the production were declining in quality. This is one of the more counterintuitive facts about the show. The period when the writing was arguably least consistent was also the period when certain categories of Easter egg work reached their highest point. One reason for this is the accumulation of show history. By season 10, the show had 11 years of content to reference. The writers could deploy callbacks that required the viewer to remember something from season 2 or 3, and there was now an audience large enough and dedicated enough to make those callbacks meaningful. The more history a show has, the richer the potential field for self-referential Easter eggs becomes. The Big Bang Theory, not the television show, but the cosmological event, becomes the subject of a hidden joke in the Stewie mythology across several middle-era episodes. In episodes that deal with Stewie's time travel capabilities and their implications, background details suggest that the Family Guy universe has a specific cosmological history that connects to Stewie's existence. Stewie's time machine, in some episodes, is capable of generating effects that have implications at a scale far larger than the immediate plot. Whether the show was building toward a coherent mythology around this or simply using it as convenient plot fuel is unclear, but the details are there for viewers who track them. The Family Guy viewer mail special episodes are among the richest sources of hidden Easter eggs in the Middle Era. These episodes, which presented alternate universe stories based on fictional viewer requests, allowed the show to try completely different animation styles, character configurations, and narrative approaches, and each of those alternative approaches contained its own set of references. In Super Griffins, the segment where the Griffin family develops superpowers, the specific powers given to each character correspond to their defining traits in ways that work as Easter eggs about the characters. Peter's power involves size and mass, corresponding to his physical bigness throughout the show. Brian's power involves speed and intelligence, corresponding to his early characterization as the fastest thinker in the household. Stewie's power is not superhuman in the typical sense, it is an escalation of something he already had, which is itself a comment on the idea that Stewie's ordinary capabilities are already extraordinary. The Road 2 episodes of this period contain their most musically dense Easter eggs. In Road to the North Pole, the Christmas episode where Brian and Stewie attempt to visit the actual Santa Claus, the musical numbers contain specific references to the Christmas musical tradition, to animated holiday specials, to specific carols to the particular sonic palette of seasonal music that reward viewers who have absorbed that tradition deeply enough to recognize individual elements being sampled and recombined. The episode's most discussed Easter egg is the dark turn it takes in its second half, when the reality of a North Pole that must produce billions of gifts for billions of children is shown to be a genuinely horrifying industrial enterprise that has broken Santa and his elves. The horror of the reveal was unexpected in an episode that had been playing as a fairly conventional holiday adventure, and the tone shift has the quality of an Easter egg that operates in mood rather than in reference, a hidden dark register embedded inside a holiday special. Expanded Section 11 continued. Mythology and hidden lore. The Family Guy universe's internal mythology extends beyond the time machine and the multiverse remote into several other areas that have been developed across the series without ever being explicitly theorized by the show itself. The giant chicken mythology is one of the most underrated elements of the show's hidden lore. Ernie the Giant Chicken, his actual name, revealed in later episodes, is not just a recurring gag device. He is a figure whose existence implies a specific world. A world in which a giant bipedal chicken can hold a job, have a wife, live in a house, and drive a car without anyone around him treating this as particularly remarkable. The unremarkability of Ernie within Quahog is itself a statement about the kind of world the show takes place, in a world where the impossible is absorbed into the ordinary without distress. Each fight between Peter and Ernie is a miniature film, a sustained action sequence with its own beginning, middle, and end, its own specific geography, its own escalating stakes. The fights reference action film traditions, the long continuous action sequence, the use of environment as combat terrain, while also being structurally absurd. But they also accumulate their own internal mythology across seasons. The specific history of why Peter and Ernie fight, the specific geography of Quahog that their fights have moved through, the specific people and places they have destroyed, all of this builds across the episodes into a hidden narrative about the show's world and its tolerance for violence. The multiverse, as established in Road to the Multiverse, has implications for the show's entire history that the show itself never fully explored. If the Family Guy universe is one of infinite parallel universes, and if Stewie has the technology to move between them, then every event that has ever happened in the show could potentially have a parallel version in another universe. The multiverse framework, once established, retroactively makes every episode a story that is happening in one specific reality while countless other realities branch alongside it, each one containing slightly or drastically different versions of the same events. This framework is never deployed as anything more than the premise of a single episode, but for viewers who sit with it, it generates interesting questions about the show's accumulated history. The death and resurrection of Brian, was this unique to the Prime timeline? Or did it happen differently in other universes? The marriages and divorces and relationships and betrayals that populate the show's history, how many of them are accidents of this specific timeline rather than necessities of any version of these characters' lives? The show's cosmological framework, God, death, heaven, hell, also implies a hidden mythology that was never systematically developed. The version of God who appears in Family Guy is specific enough, in his characteristics and his manner, to constitute a real character rather than a generic deity. He has opinions, he has a sense of humor, he makes specific choices about specific situations. But the framework within which he operates the rules of the Family Guy universe's afterlife, the specific mechanics of how death and resurrection work, when death is a character who can be negotiated with, was never laid out in any coherent way. This is actually consistent with the show's broader relationship to its own mythology. It establishes elements that imply a coherent system without committing to the work of actually building that system. The time machine, the multiverse, God, death, the chicken, all of these exist as isolated, powerful elements rather than as parts of an integrated whole. The mythology is all potential and no realization, which makes it both endlessly interesting and perpetually unsatisfying. Final expansion. The legacy of the hidden detail. What we have explored tonight is not just a catalog of clever moments and careless mistakes. It is a picture of a creative enterprise at its various stages of commitment, committed to craft, committed to production schedules, committed to commercial viability, committed to the specific human desire to put something personal into a shared public work and see if anyone notices. The Easter eggs that survive from Family Guy's earliest seasons are the clearest evidence of what the show aspired to be at its most ambitious. They suggest a team of writers and artists who believed they were making something that warranted this level of care, something that people would watch multiple times, that rewarded attention, that treated the audience as intelligent and curious. The redrum blocks in the nursery do not belong in a show made by people who did not believe in what they were creating. They belong in a show made by people who thought, our viewers will find this, and they will feel something when they do. The continuity errors, at their most revealing, tell a different story, not of creative failure exactly, but of the fundamental tension between art and industry that runs through every creative enterprise conducted at commercial scale. 22 episodes per season, multiple shows running simultaneously, a production pipeline that crosses multiple countries and involves hundreds of individual contributors. Under those conditions, the question is not whether mistakes will happen. The question is which mistakes matter enough to catch and which ones slip through because the alternative is missing a deadline. Both things can be true simultaneously. A show can be careless about the position of a room on a hallway and meticulous about a 4-letter word spelled in blocks in a baby's nursery. A show can forget how old a character is supposed to be while simultaneously building a decade-long friendship between two characters through the careful accumulation of small, consistent details. Creative enterprises are not monolithic. They are composed of individuals making individual choices, and those choices do not always add up to a coherent whole. What Family Guy offers, taken in its entirety across its enormous run, is a record of a specific moment in American entertainment, a moment when animated adult comedy became a genuine cultural force, when DVD culture and then streaming made every frame of television available for paused analysis, when fan communities began doing the critical work that once belonged exclusively to professional critics. The Easter eggs belong to that moment. They were made for audiences who had VCRs and DVD players, and eventually streaming services and the ability to watch the same 30 seconds 20 times in a row. They were made for the internet age, before the internet age had a name, and they persist. New viewers discovering the show for the first time are still finding the redrum blocks, still noticing Jesus's license plate, still catching the Holden Caulfield figure in the background of crowd scenes, still pausing on newspaper headlines and bookshelves and license plates in the backgrounds of shots that last for 2 seconds. The Easter eggs do not expire. They wait, patiently, for whoever comes next with enough attention and enough knowledge to find them. That is the final hidden detail. That is the deepest Easter egg in the whole archive. The show built things into itself that would outlast the original broadcast, that would be discovered and rediscovered long after the episodes had cycled through their first airings and their syndication runs and their streaming catalogs. The Easter eggs are how the show speaks to the future quietly, privately, waiting for someone who is paying attention. End of full script. Bonus section, every background sign and newspaper headline. The complete deep dive. When Family Guy writers want to say something they cannot say in the dialogue, they say it in the background. This is one of the show's most consistent and most rewarding practices, and it deserves a dedicated examination that covers the full range of techniques employed across the show's history. The newspaper is the most frequently used vehicle for this practice. Newspapers appear in Family Guy with remarkable regularity delivered to the Griffin House, visible on coffee tables, held by characters in the foreground of scenes while more interesting material plays out behind them. And the newspapers almost always contain readable text. The headline is sometimes relevant to the episode's plot. The secondary headlines, the subheadings, the sidebar text, the bylines, these are where the real content lives. In the Season 5 episode Peter's Two Dads, a newspaper visible in the background of a kitchen scene contains a primary headline about a local event and a secondary headline that, if you can read it, references a specific historical event that has no connection whatsoever to anything happening in the episode. This kind of non-sequitur newspaper content was a reliable technique in the show's middle era. The idea that news media in Quahog covers the same eclectic range of stories that real newspapers do, and that sometimes the real news in any given moment is the story that does not seem to belong in the paper at all. The fictional newspaper of Quahog, the Quahog Informer, appears with enough regularity across the series to constitute a recurring prop with its own aesthetic identity. The paper has a consistent masthead design, a consistent typographic style, and a consistent relationship between the size of headlines and the weight of the stories they announce. Within that consistency, the hidden content lives in the body text, the material that no one would reasonably read in real time, but that rewards the viewer who pauses and zooms in. One of the most discussed specific examples of this is the headline joke referenced in the research. DVDs paused for headline joke, millions disappointed. This is the show making itself aware of its own Easter egg tradition, catching the viewer in the act of looking and then giving them nothing but the acknowledgement that they are looking. It is a joke about the joke, a meta Easter egg that requires the viewer to have been searching for Easter eggs in order to land. The viewer who never pauses on newspaper text would never find this headline. The viewer who always pauses on newspaper text finds it and immediately feels gently mocked for their own habit. The show has deployed several variations on this technique across its history. In other episodes, background text visible only to the pausing viewer says things like, "Nothing to see here," or contains text that directly addresses the viewer's act of pausing. This self-awareness about the Easter egg tradition was something the show developed gradually, from an early period where the hidden content was purely for the viewer's benefit, to a later period where the hidden content included commentary on the practice of hiding content. Business signs in Quahog are another rich category. The town's commercial district, glimpsed in various establishing shots across the series, contains a remarkable number of businesses with names that are either jokes in their own right or references to other things. Some of these business names are visible for only a single frame in an episode and have been cataloged almost entirely by freeze-frame analysis by dedicated fans. The full list, assembled across multiple fan archives, runs to dozens of entries across the series, a hidden commercial directory of a fictional Rhode Island town that tells its own story about the sensibility of the people who created it. The bar at the Drunken Clam contains signs that change between episodes but consistently contain jokes. Beer brands visible on tap handles and bottle labels reference both real beer brands, sometimes with their names slightly altered to avoid legal issues, and fictional brands that appear to be local to the Quahog region. The fictional beer brands occasionally carry names that are themselves jokes. A beer called something that sounds reputable, but whose full name is an obscene phrase when read carefully. The show used its background signage as a continuous, low-level comedy delivery system that operated entirely beneath the level of the primary narrative. Hospital scenes in Family Guy are particularly rich environments for background signage. The show's characters end up in hospitals with surprising frequency. The violence of the show's comedy creates medical situations regularly, and the hospital sets are typically packed with signage that ranges from standard institutional messaging to completely absurd institutional messaging. Medical notices that, if read carefully, say things that no actual medical notice would say. Informational posters that contain information that is incorrect, impossible, or specifically designed to be unhelpful. The hospital is the most bureaucratic environment in the Quahog world, and the animators treated its bureaucratic surfaces as comedy canvases. The school where Meg and Chris attend, James Woods Regional High School, named after the actor who became one of the show's recurring joke targets, contains a consistently deployed set of background details in its hallway and classroom scenes. Lockers in the hallway contain names on them that change between episodes, but occasionally include names that are references to writers on the show's staff, names from other pop culture properties, or names that are jokes in their own right. This tradition of putting staff names into the background of scenes is common in animation. It functions as a kind of informal credit sequence that rewards the attentive viewer while being invisible to anyone who is not specifically looking for names. Classroom scenes in the school contain blackboard content that is often related to the subject being taught in ways that are either accurate and obscure, a chemistry lesson with real chemical equations visible in the background, or deliberately wrong a history lesson with dates or facts that are incorrect. Both categories function as Easter eggs, the accurate, obscure details for viewers who know enough about the relevant field to recognize them, and the deliberate errors for viewers who are paying enough attention to catch the mistake. The Griffin's Kitchen, one of the most frequently used rooms in the show, accumulates background detail across the seasons in a way that creates a kind of archaeology of the family's life. The refrigerator, as mentioned, is a primary surface for background content drawings, magnets, notes, shopping lists. But the kitchen also contains other surfaces: the cupboard doors, the window above the sink, the small bulletin board that appears in some episodes near the telephone. All of these are places where content can be hidden, and all of them have been used for this purpose at various points in the show's history. The living room, where the family watches television and where a significant portion of the show's dialogue scenes take place, contains a piano that belongs to Lois. The piano appears in many scenes as a background element, and occasionally it contains hidden content in the form of sheet music visible on the music stand. The sheet music, when identifiable, is always a specific piece, not a generic representation of sheet music, but an actual musical work that, if you know music, you can identify from the notation visible on the page. The choice of what piece is on the music stand at any given moment is not random. It reflects either Lois's character, a classical musician, or comments quietly on the scene or episode taking place around it. Bonus section. The voice cast as Easter eggs. One of the most overlooked categories of Easter eggs in Family Guy is the use of celebrity voices in ways that contain hidden layers of reference, casting choices that work on the surface as simple celebrity appearances but that contain additional meaning for viewers who know the specific history or work of the person being cast. When Rush Limbaugh appeared as himself in the episode A Fish Out of Water, the casting carried cultural weight that made the appearance more than just a celebrity cameo. Limbaugh's presence in the Family Guy universe was a statement about the show's relationship to conservative media, a relationship that was adversarial, but that the show did not avoid. The casting said, "We can have our ideological opponents on the show, we can even give them their own voice, because our satire is secure enough to survive the engagement." The Easter egg is in the subtext of the casting choice. When Bryan Cranston appeared in a guest role, the appearance was interesting partly for what it said about the cultural moment Cranston, at the peak of his Breaking Bad fame, being deployed in an animated comedy, and partly for the specific ways the episode used his presence. The writers could have simply had Cranston play a version of himself. Instead, the episode leaned into the particular quality that Cranston had developed as an actor, a kind of intense moral complexity in ways that worked with the show's themes rather than just exploiting the celebrity. Recognition. The use of Adam West as Mayor West for the show's entire run deserves its own examination as a sustained Easter egg about Hollywood history. Adam West became famous as Batman in the 1960s television series, a version of the character defined by its campy, deliberately theatrical tone. When the Batman franchise was revived in the late 1980s and early 1990s as a darker, more serious property, the Adam West version was largely set aside, treated as an embarrassment to the property's legacy rather than as a legitimate artistic choice. West himself navigated this rejection thoughtfully, continuing to work while also being willing to comment on and parody his own legacy. Family Guy's Mayor West character was built on this history. West agreed to play a character who was defined by an elaborate and specific kind of madness, a character who operated according to his own eccentric logic while holding a position of civic authority. The comedy was specific to West's cultural history. It worked because the audience knew who Adam West was and what he had been through, and the character's particular quality of dignified eccentricity felt like a continuation of the West persona rather than a departure from it. Every Mayor West scene is an Easter egg about Adam West's biography, legible to viewers who knew enough about 1960s television history to understand what they were watching. The guest voice tradition in Family Guy also generated specific Easter eggs through casting choices that referenced the show's own history. When a character who had been played by a specific celebrity returned in a later episode and was played by a different celebrity, the recasting was occasionally made part of the joke, a hidden comment on the way celebrity culture works, or on the show's own relationship to its guest roster. The James Woods running joke deserves special attention in this context because it is one of the most sustained celebrity as Easter egg traditions in the show's history. James Woods first appeared in a Season 4 episode where Peter discovered that Woods could be lured and captured using trail candy. The joke was partly about celebrity vulnerability, the idea that even a famous person could be manipulated by something as simple as a candy trail, and partly about the specific cultural perception of James Woods as a figure in Hollywood. Woods appeared multiple times across subsequent seasons, and his appearances built into a running mythology about his relationship with Peter and with the show's world. Each appearance was an Easter egg that referenced the previous appearances, a callback within callback structure that rewarded loyal viewers who had been following the show long enough to remember where the James Woods gag had been before. When the joke eventually reached the point where the show seemed to genuinely like James Woods as a collaborator, when his appearances became warm rather than adversarial, that shift was itself a hidden story, legible only to viewers who had tracked the whole arc. The most genuinely surprising piece of casting as Easter egg in the show's history is probably the use of Tony Sirico as Vinny. Sirico as Polly Walnuts was one of the most beloved characters in The Sopranos, a show that existed in a completely different cultural register from Family Guy. The Sopranos was prestige cable drama at its most serious. Family Guy was animated comedy at its most irreverent. Putting Polly Walnuts' voice in a temporary replacement dog was a collision of cultural worlds so unexpected that viewers who loved both shows did not quite know how to process it. The Easter egg, the recognition of Sirico's specific voice and its specific cultural associations, arrived immediately, before any other element of the character had been established. Bonus section: the show within the show, meta-references and self-awareness. Family Guy's history of self-referential humor constitutes one of its most complex Easter egg traditions, because the jokes about the show's own nature require a different kind of knowledge than the show's other references. To get a Star Wars Easter egg, you need to know Star Wars. To get a self-referential Easter egg about Family Guy, you need to know Family Guy, which means these jokes are designed specifically for the most committed, longest-watching viewers. The show's self-awareness about its own structure began early. The cutaway gag format was acknowledged from the beginning as a structural choice, rather than a natural feature of animated storytelling. The characters' phrases that introduce cutaways, "This is worse than the time," are themselves meta-commentary, characters who know they exist in a story where digression is structural. In the early seasons, this meta-awareness was light, a gentle acknowledgement of the form. In later seasons, it became more aggressive, with characters directly addressing the audience, commenting on the show's length, and making jokes about the quality of recent episodes. The Inside Family Guy episode, where the show depicted the Griffins as characters in a television production who are aware of their fictional status, is the most explicit version of this tradition. But it was preceded by many years of softer versions. Moments where a character's dialogue broke the fourth wall just enough to acknowledge the fictional frame without fully committing to metafiction. These half-breaks were Easter eggs for viewers sensitive to the exact line between a joke that exists inside the story and a joke that comments on the story from outside. The show's self-referential jokes about its own declining quality, which became more frequent in the later seasons, constitute a particularly interesting category of meta Easter egg. When a character makes a joke about the show having gone on too long, or about the writers having run out of ideas, the joke contains an embedded acknowledgement of exactly the criticism that the show's critics had been making for years. Whether these self-critical moments were genuine acts of self-awareness or a way of preemptively disarming criticism through humor is a question that the show never answered directly. What is interesting from an Easter egg perspective is that these self-critical moments often appeared in episodes that were, in other respects, quite good. An episode might contain a joke about the show's quality declining in an era when the surrounding episode was sharper and funnier than average. The disconnect between the content of the self-critical joke and the quality of the surrounding content suggested that the self-criticism was not always entirely sincere. It was sometimes a character choice, a way of occupying a particular cultural position, rather than a genuine assessment of the work. The specific episodes that contained the most sophisticated self-referential content were often the ones written by the show's most experienced writers, the people who had been in the room since the beginning and who understood both what the show had been and what it had become. Their self-referential jokes carried more weight than the same jokes written by newer staff, because they came from people who had personally experienced the transitions they were joking about. The ending of every Road to episode is a consistent Easter egg about the show's relationship to its own conventions. The Road to format always resolved with the characters returning home, and the resolution always involved some acknowledgement that the adventure, however fantastical, however world-altering in scope, would be processed, absorbed, and essentially not mentioned in the following episode. This is the show commenting on its own episodic amnesia, the standard animated sitcom condition where events do not accumulate into permanent change. The joke about going home and everything returning to normal is, in the Road to episodes, both the obvious comedy ending and a hidden commentary on the condition of being characters in an animated sitcom. The musical numbers in the Road to episodes are themselves Easter eggs, in the sense that they embed a specific theatrical tradition, the mid-20th century Broadway and Hollywood musical, inside an animated comedy framework where that tradition is simultaneously honored and parodied. The humor of the musical numbers comes from the incongruity between the grandeur of the musical form and the absurdity of the situation being sung about. But beneath that incongruity is genuine craft. The arrangements are technically accomplished, the lyrics are better than they need to be, the melodies are genuinely memorable. The Easter egg for music-literate viewers is in recognizing that the show was not just parodying musicals, but actually producing something within the tradition being parodied. The ASMR quality that makes this kind of content work as sleep aid material is itself a kind of Easter egg about the show, a recognition that Family Guy, despite its reputation for frenetic comedy and shock value, contains enormous quantities of material that is genuinely soothing when encountered in the right context. The voice performances, particularly MacFarlane's work as Brian, have a warmth and low-register quality that carries comfort even in scenes that are comedically charged. The ambient sound design, the background noise of the Griffin house, the specific acoustic texture of the drunken clam, the sound of Quahog's residential streets is carefully designed to evoke a specific kind of familiar domestic world. These elements are always present. They are just usually not what people focus on. The final Easter egg in Family Guy's history is perhaps the most personal one, and it belongs to Seth MacFarlane himself. He missed Flight 11 on the 11th of September 2001 by approximately 10 minutes. He was supposed to be on a plane that was hijacked and flown into the World Trade Center. He was saved by a hangover, by his travel agent's mistake, by 10 minutes of margin between the world where he lived and the world where he did not. MacFarlane has spoken about this in interviews, and he has addressed it in the show most directly in Back to the Pilot, where Brian and Stewie's time travel involves decisions about whether to prevent the attacks. But the deeper Easter egg of that event is not in any specific episode or any specific dialogue. It is in the fact that Family Guy exists at all. That the show came back from its first cancellation, that it found its audience through Adult Swim reruns and DVD sales, that it survived long enough to become one of the longest-running animated comedies in television history. All of that required MacFarlane to be alive and working and building his creative empire. It required him to have overslept on the morning of the 11th of September, 2001. The show is the Easter egg. 24-plus seasons of hidden details and production mistakes and character inconsistencies, and deep-cut references, and self-aware meta-commentary. All of it exists because one man was late for a flight. There is no intentionality to that Easter egg. It is not something the show put there for you to find, but it is the hidden thing that underlies everything else, the impossible coincidence that made all the deliberate choices possible. That is the one you cannot pause on. That is the one you cannot find by zooming in. That is the one you can only appreciate by sitting back and taking in the whole picture at once. Full script end. Bonus section: the giant chicken fights a detailed breakdown of hidden Easter eggs. Few recurring elements in animated television history have been analyzed and cataloged as thoroughly as the fights between Peter Griffin and Ernie the Giant Chicken. These sequences appear at irregular intervals across the show's run, always structured the same way: a chance encounter, a reminder of the original slight, an extended and increasingly destructive battle through multiple environments, and always ending with Peter walking away from an apparently dead or defeated chicken, only for Ernie to survive and the cycle to continue. What is less often discussed is the degree to which each individual chicken fight contains specific visual references and Easter eggs that go beyond the basic gag structure. The fights are not generic action sequences. They are carefully choreographed sequences that borrow specific techniques from specific action film traditions. The first major chicken fight, in the Season 2 episode Da Boom, established the visual language that all subsequent fights would reference. The fight moved through multiple environments in a way that recalled the extended action sequences of Jackie Chan films from the late 1980s and early 1990s. Specifically, the style Chan developed of using ordinary, Environments as elaborate obstacle courses, turning kitchens and construction sites and shopping malls into action choreography. The first chicken fight was not just a parody of action movies in general. It was a specific homage to a specific style of action filmmaking, legible to viewers who knew Chan's work well enough to recognize the choreographic DNA. The second major chicken fight escalated the scale and density of the action, and in doing so began referencing blockbuster action cinema of the 1990s, the die-hard template, the lethal weapon aesthetic, the visual language of action spectacle that defined Hollywood cinema for a decade. The environments the fight moved through in this second installment were larger, more destructive, more cinematic in their scale. The fight was saying, we have graduated from the relatively intimate scale of the first fight into something with genuine blockbuster ambition. Each subsequent chicken fight built on the accumulated history of the previous ones in ways that added hidden meaning. By the time the fights reached the most elaborate versions seen in the middle and later seasons, they had become so self-aware about their own tradition that specific moments referenced not just action cinema in general, but specific moments from earlier chicken fights within the show. A particular maneuver deployed in a later fight would echo a maneuver from an earlier fight, creating an internal reference that rewarded viewers who had watched all the fights carefully. The revelation of Ernie's name, his status as not just a prop, but a genuine character with a history and a domestic life, came in a later season episode that reimagined the chicken fight tradition from Ernie's perspective. This episode revealed that Ernie is married, that he has a job, that he has a life beyond his conflict with Peter. The revelation recontextualized every previous fight. The Easter egg for viewers who caught the recontextualization was a sudden retroactive sympathy for Ernie, who had been fighting Peter for reasons that were originally Peter's fault, but that had clearly been sustained by both parties across many years. The expired coupon that started the whole conflict, the original incident where Ernie gave Peter a coupon that turned out to be past its use date, is itself a hidden joke about the nature of grudges and conflict escalation. The scale of the violence that has resulted from the coupon incident is wildly, comedically disproportionate. But the underlying observation about how minor disputes can escalate into genuine enmity through cycles of retaliation is not entirely without truth. The Easter egg buried in the chicken fight mythology is a quiet sociological observation about human conflict, dressed in the most absurd possible costume. Bonus section: the music of Family Guy hidden orchestral references. Seth MacFarlane is a musician. This is not a secondary fact about him, it is central to how Family Guy was conceived and produced. MacFarlane has released multiple albums of big band and jazz standards, hosted concerts featuring full orchestral arrangements, and consistently used music in Family Guy with a sophistication that exceeded what most animated sitcoms attempted. The music of Family Guy contains its own category of Easter eggs, hidden in the orchestration and arrangement of the show's background score in ways that require musical training or broad musical knowledge to fully appreciate. Ron Jones, who scored the majority of the show's early seasons, brought a tradition of orchestral television scoring to the work, a full orchestra approach that was unusual for a primetime animated comedy. His scores reference the specific sonic palette of 1970s and 1980s television, the era that MacFarlane grew up in, and they did so in ways that were simultaneously nostalgic and contemporary. Specific musical quotes embedded in the background score were references to the television themes of that era, audible to viewers with a specific generational experience of watching television in those decades. Walter Murphy, who has scored the show across many seasons, brought a different tradition, a background in pop production and film scoring that gave him a different set of tools for building emotional texture in scenes. Murphy's scores often contain specific stylistic allusions, a moment of Bernard Herrmann-style tension scoring here, a moment of John Barry-style romantic arrangement there that rewarded viewers whose knowledge of film music was broad enough to recognize the styles being invoked. The musical numbers in Family Guy are perhaps the richest territory for Easter eggs in the entire show. When Family Guy characters break into song, which happens with genuine frequency, more than most casual viewers remember, the songs are almost always structured within specific musical traditions that reward listeners who can identify them. A song performed in the style of a Rodgers and Hammerstein musical carries specific harmonic and melodic conventions that distinguish it from a song performed in the style of a Stephen Sondheim musical, and the show's music department was capable of navigating these differences with real craft. The It's a Wonderful Day for Pi sequence from Road to the Multiverse has been specifically praised by music critics, who noted that the song captured the specific sound of Walt Disney's Golden Age musical formula, the particular harmonic language, the specific orchestration style, the way the melodic contour moved with accuracy that went beyond parody into genuine pastiche. The Easter egg is for viewers who know Disney musicals well enough to recognize not just that this sounds like a Disney song, but how it sounds like a Disney song, which specific technical choices create the effect. The Conway Twitty sequences that became one of the show's most polarizing recurring gags were themselves a kind of Easter egg about country music history. Conway Twitty was a real country singer, enormously successful across several decades, whose name became essentially a joke outside of country music fan communities. The combination of sounds in Conway Twitty struck non-fans as inherently comic. The joke in the Family Guy sequences was on multiple levels. It was a joke about country music as a genre, a joke about Conway Twitty's specific cultural status, a joke about the show itself, wasting time with something that was simultaneously a real piece of music and a refusal to provide the comedy the viewer was expecting. The Easter egg was for country music fans, for whom the sequences had a completely different quality, genuine, if wry, appreciation of a real artist, embedded inside a joke that most viewers experienced only as empty time-filling. Bonus section: the geography of Quahog, hidden details of the fictional city. Quahog, Rhode Island does not exist. There is a real place in Rhode Island called Quahog. It is a type of hard-shelled clam that is common to the region, and it names several places in the state, but the city depicted in Family Guy is fictional. However, the show has been consistent enough in its depiction of Quahog's geography and architecture that the fictional city has developed a genuine internal coherence that rewards attention. The city's layout, as implied by the establishing shots and location scenes across the series, positions the Griffin House on Spooner Street in a residential neighborhood of single-family homes that is clearly meant to evoke a specific kind of working-class New England neighborhood. The architecture Cape Cods, triple-deckers, the specific kind of compact urban housing that characterizes Rhode Island's older residential neighborhoods is accurate enough to the regional style that it functions as a hidden homage to a specific kind of American place. The commercial districts depicted in Quahog contain specific kinds of businesses that reflect the show's Rhode Island setting in subtle ways. The seafood restaurants, the specific kinds of bars, the architecture of the shopping areas. These details are specific enough to New England that they function as Easter eggs for viewers who are familiar with that region. Rhode Island has a specific commercial culture, a specific relationship to seafood, a specific history of small-scale retail establishments. And Quahog's depicted commercial landscape reflects this with enough accuracy to be recognizable to someone who knows the real Rhode Island. The bay that Quahog sits on the body of water, visible in various establishing shots, is designed to suggest Narragansett Bay, the large tidal estuary that dominates Rhode Island's geography. The bay's relationship to the town, the way the waterfront areas look and function, the specific quality of the light in scenes set near the water. These are details that reflect a familiarity with actual Rhode Island coastal geography, however much they have been simplified and fictionalized for animation. The school, James Woods Regional High School, is named after the actor, but it is also placed geographically within the show's world in a specific way that creates a consistent sense of Meg and Chris's daily spatial experience. The route from the Griffin House to the school, when implied by the characters' movements across different episodes, suggests a specific spatial relationship between the residential neighborhood and the school's location. This spatial consistency is the kind of detail that most viewers never consciously notice, but that contributes to the show's sense of being a real place rather than just a backdrop. The Quahog Airport, the Quahog Police Department, the hospital, the town hall, each of these institutional buildings has been designed with enough specificity that attentive viewers can track their locations relative to each other and relative to the Griffin House. The geography is not entirely consistent across all the seasons. The show has never been committed to cartographic precision, but it is consistent enough in its broad strokes that Quahog functions as a real place in the imagination of viewers who have watched enough episodes. The final hidden detail about Quahog's geography is in its relationship to the real places of Rhode Island. The show has referenced actual Rhode Island locations: Providence, Newport, the beaches of South County, the specific culture of a specific state with enough frequency and enough accuracy that Quahog feels like it belongs in the same universe as the real Rhode Island, just slightly to the side of it, occupying a fictional space adjacent to the real one. This adjacency is itself an Easter egg, a quiet statement that Family Guy's world is rooted in a specific real place, that the comedy it generates is in some sense the comedy of that specific regional culture, filtered through the imagination of a creator who grew up there and knows it from the inside.